time and a look at the British government at work. Later, watch Road to the White House for a weekly look at the 1992 presidential campaign. Sundays beginning at 8 p.m. only on C-SPAN.
This morning, the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on Terrorism, Narcotics, and International Operations continued its series of hearings into the implications of the collapse of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, or BCCI. The Luxembourg-based bank was indicted last week in New York for bank fraud, and ongoing investigations have led to bank assets being seized in 8 countries, including the U.S. BCCI has operations in 69 countries. The Federal Reserve Board announced last week that it will seek $200 million in fines against BCCI for evidence of secret deals between senior officials of the bank and some of its customers to purchase 3 U.S. banks. Last week, the subcommittee heard from a customs commissioner from the Reagan administration and members of the Federal Reserve Board and the State Department, as well as representatives from other countries involved in the BCCI dealings. Today, the sole witness was a former chief financial officer for BCCI, Mazahar Rahman.
The hearing will come to order. Good morning. This morning, we're going to hear the testimony under oath of Mr. Mazahar Rahman, who was the chief financial officer for BCCI from 1975 through 1990. I want to say for the record that Mr. Rahman is here voluntarily, having come to the United States following threats to his physical safety in London. He has not been able to talk publicly for the last year about BCCI as a result of a court order that was entered into in London at BCCI's request. On Saturday, my staff and the staff of the Federal Reserve went to meet Mr. Rahman at Kennedy Airport in New York with a short amount of notice that he was coming and that he was concerned about his physical safety. And in cooperation with United States Customs officials and immigration officials, and I express my appreciation to the State Department and to Bob Kimmett, who assisted in guaranteeing that his entry was facilitated, he is now here before us of his own desire. He's testifying today in accordance with a revised court order granted in London last week at my request, which permits him to testify. This court order specifically permits him to testify before the United States Senate, and in addition, I would add that his testimony is secured with the full and complete cooperation of the Federal Reserve, of the Manhattan District Attorney, Mr. Bob Morgenthau, and of the Justice Department. Now, obviously, and I say it right up front, the scheduling of a hearing like this during recess and on short notice is unusual. I was personally reluctant to do it, but I think that the circumstances are urgent enough that it was important that we do it. Most importantly, I think Mr. Rahman feels very strongly that he wants to get this story out, that he has been living under a personal cloud, which I have come to understand quite well as I have met him and his family yesterday. He has 2 very attractive, intelligent young children who are feeling the pressures of this transition. And his wife is here who joins him, who is seated right in back with him. She is American from New York and is also feeling the tensions and pressures of what has happened to their life as a consequence of this. Therefore, we really made a decision that because of the threat to physical safety and because of his own personal feelings about the need to get this behind him, that we would proceed today. I personally talked to Senator Pell and to Senator Brown in order to clear with them the notion of proceeding forward. And Senator Brown, who cannot be here because he is on a trip out of country, felt it was also very important to proceed forward, and we'll have a statement for the record. Let me just review very, very quickly for the record the BCCI road that we've traveled to this point, and then Senator Cranston has asked me to read into the record a few comments of his, and he has submitted some questions. First, we've learned a lot about BCCI to date. We know that BCCI was a bank whose senior officers created a web of corruption that extended literally around the world. Second, we know that because of its unique status of being located everywhere but regulated nowhere, in the context that most of us think of bank regulation, BCCI became a natural haven for the movement of narcotics money or the proceeds of crime, or even for nefarious deals. Third, we know that BCCI's chief officer, Agha Hassan Abedi, and others systematically developed ties with leaders around the world, with people in positions of influence, and provided these people at various levels with favors and benefits of various kinds, ranging from creating charities to strengthening these leaders politically or otherwise, to helping to arrange arms deals, to creating slush funds of the kind that General Noriega had. Fourth, BCCI used its political ties to obtain open control of many banks around the world, which became part of the BCCI family, and secret control of other banks, which we have seen in the case of a number of banks here in the United States. Fifth, foreign and domestic intelligence agencies developed close ties to BCCI. We know of some of those ties, though not all of them. Knowing of BCCI's criminal activities, the CIA and other intelligence agencies made use of BCCI for a variety of purposes, some yet to be disclosed. Sixth, we know that law enforcement and regulators in this and in other countries had a certain amount of information, substantial by the late 1980s, concerning the nature and extent of BCCI's criminal schemes. And yet, with the exception of the prosecution of some low-level personnel in Miami, nothing seemed to happen until this issue hit the center pages, front pages, and until recently. Seventh, we know that BCCI is an institution which lost billions of dollars, and we will hear something of how that happened this morning. And those billions in losses were systematically concealed by BCCI's leadership. And our witness this morning will define that leadership and the extent of the knowledge within the bank of that. And that this loss or series of losses were hidden in part by BCCI's practice of obtaining substantial central bank deposits from governments all over the world. The collapse of BCCI has already threatened some of these governments, and it will be some time before the full extent of government losses globally will be understood. Eighth, we know that the accountants and lawyers hired by BCCI wound up helping the bank to conceal the true nature of its activities for some time, and that occurred even after serious allegations had arisen about criminal activity. The consequence of these facts, largely hidden until recently, is now demonstrated daily around the world. In India, money laundering rackets involving BCCI and aides to assassinated Indian leader Rajiv Gandhi are now under investigation. In Pakistan, issues arise about BCCI's involvement in its illegal nuclear arms development program. In Egypt, the government has closed BCCI on money laundering charges after a run on the bank. In Argentina, as a result of hearings which this committee held last week, allegations have been raised that BCCI was brokering the sale of French Mirage jets to Saddam Hussein. In Cameroon, a government with few resources now has even less as a result of BCCI-related losses. There isn't an American who doesn't understand the impact of the drug problem in this country. It's a problem for all of us, but also for people all around the world, not just Americans. And arms trafficking has brought misery around the globe. The spread of nuclear weapons, needless to say, creates even greater risks of confrontation and of destruction. When a bank like BCCI moves drug money and big dollar weapons money and helps terrorists acquire the material to make nuclear bombs, if that's what they did, while political leaders who are supposed to be protecting them move aside, then governments themselves wind up becoming partners in the enterprise of those criminals. A big part of this problem is that BCCI came to believe that it could buy anything and facilitate everything. We've learned a lot in recent weeks, but I must say to you, what strikes me particularly is the degree to which this bank thought it could steamroll any obstacles that lay in its path. Certainly laws and standards were no barrier. Why? Because BCCI thought it could buy everything. Buy lawyers, buy accountants, buy regulators, buy access, buy loyalty, buy governments, buy safety, buy protection, and even buy silence. And what it couldn't buy or didn't need to, it could facilitate. You need a Mirage jet to go to Saddam Hussein, BCCI could facilitate it. If you wanted weapons in the Mideast, and possibly even atomic weapons, who do you call? BCCI. You want drug money to move from cartel to safe haven? BCCI. It gave new meaning to the term full-service bank. Today, we continue the process of trying to understand what happened with BCCI and who was responsible. And hopefully, out of all this will come a stronger effort by government and the private sector to prevent this kind of behavior from scarring the political landscape and the business landscape. Mr. Rahman, we are very pleased to have you here today. You are an intelligent and thoughtful person who has spent a lifetime really in the field of finance and who understands this bank as well, I suppose, as most people, with perhaps a few exceptions of those who are at the highest level, as I think you will describe. Before we begin, I would like to make a part of the record the court order which permits you to appear here today, and we will label that for today's hearing Exhibit 1. And I will read, as I promised Senator Cranston I would, his opening comments. It's a statement by Senator Alan Cranston. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The events of the last 2 weeks have certainly contributed to the sense of the enormity of the scandal associated with the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, as well as to the feeling that we are still a long way from discovering the full truth about this criminal enterprise. For that reason, I'm pleased to add my welcome to our witness today. I hope he can shed the kind of light on this investigation which will not only illuminate but also serve as a beacon for further investigation. Since our hearings last week, information on several aspects of the BCCI scandal have come to my attention. This is Senator Cranston. Mr. Chairman, as you remember, last week I mentioned the case of the London Financial Times journalist, Anson Ng, who was found murdered in his Guatemala City apartment. At the time, I mentioned the suspicion in journalism circles in Guatemala that Ng's murder was related to arms trafficking allegedly carried out by BCCI in collusion with top leaders of the Guatemalan military. Since then, information concerning Ng's death has come to my attention that I believe is of direct concern to this committee's deliberations. First, according to people who talked by phone with Ng in the days before his death, the British journalist mentioned to them he was working on a, quote, big story related to BCCI in Guatemala. Second, although officials in Guatemala have sought to characterize Ng's assassination as the work of common criminals, the murder seems to be the work of professional hitmen. In this regard, I might mention the following details, given to me by close friends of Ng. Apparently, a silencer was used in the killing, which was done by a single bullet wound to the head. Guatemalan authorities say that no bullet was found either in the body or in the apartment. I am told that Ng's head was wrapped in a towel and his body left in the bathroom, something consistent with efforts to keep the murder secret for a period of time. According to those closest to Ng, a set of documents were stolen from his desk, and reportedly the Guatemalan authorities have impounded a set of computer disks Ng used for his work. Once again, I urge President Serrano to take all necessary steps to ensure that Ng's killers are brought to justice, no matter what their rank or station in life. Some have characterized, wrongly, BCCI's operation as a victimless crime. Anson Ng's death suggests how vacuous a lie that is. Mr. Chairman, last week I also brought to the committee's attention BCCI's apparent attempt to serve as an intermediary for the sale of 22 Mirage aircraft belonging to the Argentine Air Force. Yesterday, my office received a very credible report concerning attempts to sell these sophisticated aircraft. According to a highly credible source in Argentina, whose name I cannot reveal, the planes were to be sold in August or September of 1989 by way of BCCI. Their would-be purchaser was a man whose name later became sadly familiar to every household in our land, Saddam Hussein. According to this Argentine source, whose honesty is not in question, BCCI in Argentina was working with a retired high-ranking naval officer in promoting the sale. It apparently did not take place because of rivalries within the Argentine armed forces themselves. Finally, Mr. Chairman, the role played by Pakistani authorities, both those of the current government and those of the Zia dictatorship, in the BCCI scandal have raised many questions, some of which I hope we can get answers to today. Among the questions I hope we can address are those concerning BCCI's role in Pakistan's nuclear program, its alleged participation in the destabilization and overthrow of Benazir Bhutto's democratic government, the reported rake-off of U.S. foreign assistance monies, and other issues of generalized corruption in Pakistan. As I said, I hope there are some answers today because, as one can see, there are no lack of questions. Thank you. And that completes the statement by Senator Alan Cranston, which he asked that I read this morning. Mr. Rahman, may I ask, please, that you stand so I can swear you in? Would you raise your right hand? Do you swear to tell the truth and the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. If you'd be seated, and if you could pull the microphone close to you, I think that would be very helpful. Would you state your full name for the record, please?
My name is Masihur Rahman, Masihur Rahman.
And Mr. Rahman, where are you currently residing, or where were you residing until recently?
I was residing in London till recently.
Okay. And what day did you leave London?
I left last Saturday.
Now, you are how old?
57.
You were born where?
I was born in Calcutta in India.
Could you tell us a little bit about your background, please?
Yes. My father was in the judiciary. He was Chief Justice of the High Court. And he was the first Muslim in the subcontinent to acquire the esteemed title of ICS, Indian Civil Service rank, and went to judiciary.
What years would he have been holding that?
That was going back to the early 40s and late 39s. And therefore I was born and brought up to an extent in a judicial home. And that has stayed with me, I think, all my life. He died, we had 9 brothers and sisters, and when he died, soon after that, the partition of India took place, and we had to leave for Pakistan, that was East Pakistan from Calcutta, and whatever pension rights he had also lapsed because of the chaotic conditions. So from a very early age of about 9, all our brothers and sisters had to self-educate themselves in the house. We didn't go to any formal schooling, and I did matriculation along with my sister privately. After that, I got a scholarship to go to the university, and I finished my university in
What university was that?
Dhaka University. That's the capital of what was East Pakistan in those days. And I graduated in '56 and went to England, where I was working and studying at the same time from 1956 to 1961. I qualified as a CPA. In England it is called FCA. I'm a fellow of the Institute of Chartered Accountants, which is the equivalent of CPA in USA. I also did simultaneously cost and management, which is an FCMA title, which is industrial accounting. So literally I and my brothers and sisters have had to grow up on our own. My mother is illiterate, and we had to sustain ourselves by working in the day and studying at night. And I became the first person in the whole of the subcontinent to get both chartered accountancy and cost and management titles. And with these, I returned back to Pakistan. And immediately after that...
What year did you return to Pakistan?
1961. And immediately after that, I was appointed in a government organization, which was the Industrial Development Corporation, the Pakistan Industrial Development Corporation. This corporation oversaw all the heavy industries of the country, including petrochemical, steel mill, refinery, shipbuilding. Soon after my arrival in Pakistan...
That was a political appointment?
No, I was a technocrat, and I was appointed directly as finance chief of finance.
Chief of finance of this unit?
Of PIDC, yes. Okay. Soon after that, the PIDC itself was split into two parts, West Pakistan Industrial Development Corporation and East Pakistan Industrial Development Corporation. So I went along with the East Pakistan Development Corporation and became the chief of finance of that operation. We had about 11 industries in that year, and by the time I left in 1966, we had 74, 75 industries, including, it was a very hectic period of development in Pakistan and East Pakistan. And we saw very heavy industries like steel mill and refinery and petrochemical projects come out. In that capacity, I met a lot of very important organizations like the World Bank, IMF, various credit agencies of the world, various large corporate bodies, Japanese, Italian, British, who are actually doing the construction work. So I had a very full life.
Now, is it fair to say, Mr. Rahman, that you really held two jobs in your life,
yes,
other than working when you were going through you're getting your education?
Yes.
But from the time you got your formal education, which was unique because you were the first person in the subcontinent to have these 2 degrees, you were with this government agency in charge of these finance on the development side, yes, and then secondly, you moved to BCCI, is that correct?
No, I
or to
moved
the other bank? You had a second bank. But banking was the only other job?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
And you spent a couple of years with another bank?
Yes. During the time in PIDC, because of the very big size of this corporation, all the banks used to call on us to do banking business with the corporation. At that time, I met both Mr. Naqvi and Mr. Abadi, who
now, what are the full names of Mr. Naqvi?
Mr. Naqvi's name was Mr. Swali Naqvi, SWALEHNAQVI, and Mr. Abadi was Aga Hassan Abedi, AGHA, Hassan, HASAN, ABEDI.
And these are the 2 gentlemen who became primary figures in BCCI?
Yes. At that time, they were in United Bank, which was also a very new bank in Pakistan. And in 1966, they persuaded me to leave the public sector and go to the private sector in the banking industry. So this was my first entry into the private sector and into banking. And I was made executive vice president, though I was very, very young. I was hardly 30 at the time. And I had not done banking before, so it was a very esteemed title to get at that age. There were 6 executive vice presidents in United Bank.
Okay, now let me stop you there for a minute. I just wanted to get some of your background up until the beginning of the bank, and then I want to go back to the beginning of the bank. But let me come to the present for a moment and the circumstances that bring you here. Would you share with the committee the events recently in your life that brought you to jump onto an aircraft last Saturday and flee to the United States?
as you'll hear later on, I was the Chief Finance Officer of BCCI, and in that capacity I dealt with all the audit affairs of the whole group and met Pricewaterhouse and Ernst & Young partners throughout this period. In 1989, I was made chairman of an investigation committee by the board at the recommendation of Pricewaterhouse, during which time I got to know many affairs of the bank which I did not. And this disturbed me very much. And because I was the professional in the bank, and these were items which horrified me, and I wanted to resign forthwith as soon as I finished my report. First, they did not believe me. They tried to persuade me to stay on. They tried to persuade my wife to stay on and persuade me, but I refused and I left. Since that was in August 1st, I left. Since then, my family and I have been hounded. All sorts of direct and indirect threats have been used, to the extent that Scotland Yard got to know about it, and the Guildford police got to know about it. And the Guildford police is in Surrey, and they had special security put around our house and special equipment put in the house for direct access to the police station. And my wife and children were suffering greatly because I was continuing to attend office prior to my handing over, and they were being terrorized by these situation. And my wife was having to put the children under the bed every night for fear of some physical violence or some gunshots, because another senior executive, Mr. John Hilbery, who was in BCC and left at the same time, he informed us, he lived very close to where we did, that there had been a gunshot through his window, and he had reported to the police, and therefore he was going to join me in trying to make a claim on BCC for compensation, because we received nothing when we were released. And he withdrew from this case very hurriedly because of this fear and out of this incident. So my wife, having heard this, she was even more terrified, and my children were disturbed. We had to pull them out of school.
When did you pull them out of school?
That was, I can't recall exactly, it was after a few months of my leaving BCC. And then I felt that it was impossible to have this tension on me while I'm trying to restructure my life. So I requested them to leave for America. So they left. I found a job in another bank.
When did they leave for America?
They left about 3 months ago. And I continued, and she was very concerned, and many of my friends and colleagues were concerned for me, and they constantly asked me that how can you carry on with this tension and live in the heart of London when anything could happen any day. Some even offered to come and live in my small flat, but I preferred to be on my own. I sincerely believe that in life all that will happen is written down. And this is a part of my culture. And I believe anything which will happen to me, and the date and time it will happen to me is already down. So I don't worry about these things, and I don't concern myself with these things. And so I stayed on. In the meanwhile, you may know that I was requested by the district attorney to come to America to give a deposition.
Before we get to Mr. Morgenthau and his request to you, can you describe for me some of the things that were frightening your wife that you told me about last night?
Well, the only direct physical threat was made to me just as I was leaving by another executive of the bank, Mr. Abbas, Mazhar Abbas, M-A-Z-H-A-R-A-B-B-A-S, who was in a meeting with me and Mr. Iqbal Chaudhry, who is the new CEO after all this crisis. And I was pleading with Mr. Iqbal Chaudhry and Mr. Mazhar Abbas, who were both junior to me effectively in the bank, that why are you sacking so many good executives when the people who are named are still in the bank, who have been identified by Pricewaterhouse and by my committee, they are still in the bank. And if indeed you are sacking all the other good executives, why are you not paying them compensation? So this line of argument went on, and finally I told them that if you force such people who have given their life to the bank to just go and become jobless and with no money to eat grass, then they may turn to any situation. They may go to court and they can fight you from the court. And Mr. Abbas said, well, they can go to hell, they can go to court if they like. So I said, if you carry on like that, I myself may have to join them. And the moment I saw that, he became furious. And he said that, let me tell you openly in front of Mr. Chaudhry that if you open your mouth or if you go to court, I have personally killed people in my life in Multan in Pakistan, and I'll use the same gun on you. Now, he was so junior to me, I didn't even take it seriously. I mean, I thought it was a funny thing to tell me. So I told him off. I said, you haven't even contributed one bit to the growth of the bank, and what are you talking about? So I just ignored him, but it stayed with me. But after I left, several of my friends and ex-colleagues were bringing information that people from Abu Dhabi, people from BCCI, who were named in this report, have said that my life is not worth the paper it's written on. And again, I ignored all this because, as I said, I don't worry about these things. But more recently, my lawyers, who have charged a lot of money for just getting nothing for me, suddenly began to change their tune. And they started to suggest to me that I should agree with the liquidator that to keep quiet. I said, this injunction which was brought by the criminal bank, by the criminal people, have all been exposed. So how can I continue to have an injunction thrust on me after new management is supposed to be there, liquidator is supposed to be there, Bank of England is supposed to be there? And they had no real answer, and they said, well, apparently Sheikh Zayed will not give money if you talk. And we need his money because so many millions have suffered. And that is a very powerful argument because I had helped in bringing the better part of the bank, and we will discuss that also later on. And thousands of people were employed, 14,000 people were employed from 83 nationalities. They were good people. And you will see when we go through this deposition that not more than 20 people were involved in all that you are hearing about. And yet, thousands of people have suffered both as employees, and over 1 million people have suffered as customers who were very loyal, good customers. They were not illegal customers, all of them. So when this argument was given, I was a bit confused as to really, is it correct that Sheikh Zayed would not give any more money if I talked? But at the same time, the press in UK started naming me, and some of them started naming me as the whistleblower, and even my picture came in the press. And I'm not a whistleblower in any capacity. I was a chief finance officer. I happened to be chairman of the investigation committee, which the board appointed me. I happened to write an honest report. I happened to resign, and I've suffered for that. But I'm not a whistleblower, and I'm not the destroyer of thousands of people's lives. But when this happened, information came to me that even clients who have lost all their savings, innocent people, any one of them could come for me anytime. So I needed a vehicle in which I could explain all that I have to explain. And the British government and the British judiciary was refusing me this right. And they would not even explain why everybody could talk what they liked, all the press could investigate and write what they wanted, and I'm a key central figure about the reports, and I'm not able to talk on some pretension. So I argued with my own lawyers, and I said, you fight back for the injunction. You fight back, I don't care. He says, you haven't paid for all your fees up to now, and this will cost extra, and you'll never win. Anyway, we fought back again, and I was horrified to hear that the Lord Chancellor himself had instructed the judge that my injunction should continue. Now, I don't know why I'm so important. I'm a British subject. I have my own rights. Why the Lord Chancellor should instruct the court to injunct me from speaking horrified me. And my own lawyers were suggesting that after all my life is ruined, I have no job, I have my house, which was a part of my salary package, was about to be taken. They told me in so many words that it will take 3 days for the government to take the house back once you start talking.
Who told you that?
Sorry?
Who told you that?
My own lawyers. That it will take less than 3 days for you to lose your house as soon as you... So
you lost your house at some point.
Not yet, but as it may be happening now.
But didn't you take a choice? You sold a house and moved into London?
No, what had happened is that we had a bigger house in Surrey in the better days, I should say.
And that was the house paid for by the bank?
All, yes. What the bank had, which was a scheme which I myself helped evolve, is that because the senior founder executives were always moving, traveling, working weekends, our families were suffering. And since we were deemed to be also shareholders of the bank, which we'll explain later on, I had recommended to the president and others that we should at least have a home sort of bequested to us as sort of advance compensation towards the share value, which is building up rapidly, so that at least the family whom you're never seeing could at least have a roof over their head if anything happened. So that scheme was approved, and that scheme is all in writing, and we are required never to pay back the loan as long as we work with BCC. Effectively, because we always expected to live and die with BCC, it was never repayable. And whatever token interest was charged, which is a small amount, 5%, was also given to us as an allowance to be returned. So effectively, it was a part of our salary package for which we are working these long hours. And within days of this injunction matter, they moved on me and nobody else for foreclosure of the house. Nobody else has had their property foreclosed, but they instantly moved on me. So I'm fighting that, but my own lawyers are telling me that the day you open your mouth, 3 days within that, the house will go.
Now, Mr. Rahman, I just want to finish on the personal aspects of this before we move into back into the history. I understood from your wife, Ellen, that there were nights when you were not there that cars would come into the driveway and simply turn off the engine and sit there and then turn on the engine and drive out. Is that accurate?
Yes, she told me several times, and that's one of the reasons I told her to leave. I don't know if they were press people, I don't know if there's somebody from BCC or, but I wasn't going to take any further risk because it's a very, very quiet part of Surrey that we live in. It's a very, very hardly any houses. It's a wooded area. So we felt that we can't take any further risk, and we just sent the family away.
Did you receive some phone calls, or did she receive phone calls?
She received some, she told me about. I have not received any, where people just tried to find out where I was or didn't say anything and just cut off.
It's my understanding that on one occasion she received a phone call in which she was told that you'd had a terrible accident and wouldn't be kind. Is that accurate?
Yes, she told me when I came back, she was crying, and she told me about this, and I said, look, if anything happens, somebody who will know you will tell you rather than an unknown person, so please don't get disturbed by unknown people talking like that.
And on another occasion, was she telephoned and told that you were going to be killed or that your life wasn't worth very much?
That, I mean, a lot of people were saying that. A lot of people were saying this, and to me, and obviously to me, to her. Friends who meant well, that, you know, it's incredible how you can sit over here knowing that you're the only one who know about the report and you did all this. And you
finally, she told me that there was one occasion, the breaking point was when a telephone call came regarding the children. Is that accurate?
She told me also, and that's why we were afraid that you know, going to school was also very dangerous. So I just pulled them off school.
And what was that phone call? Do you recall?
I can't remember the details, but it was in this nature that even the children are at risk. And
and that's when you decided she should leave the country?
Yes, I decided that she should leave. Of course, she did not want to leave, leaving me behind. And I said, look, I cannot start running, because running is a one-way traffic. You know, you start running and then you don't stop running. So I was not going to do that till just last week. And last week, as I started to explain, my fear element went up, because if the ordinary depositor have suffered, then any one of them could be violent. My pictures had come openly in the press. The Mail, Daily Mail had covered an article saying that Mr. Rahman has fled for his life and there's a killer on the loose. I mean, I don't know whether they just make up the stories or it sounds good, and that's how it was. So I decided that it's best not to confront everybody, just to leave.
Okay. Now, Mr. Rahman, because today you're going to, as you tell this story, refer to some documents, I'm going to put those documents into the record now, so they are a matter of public record. Let me just quickly identify them. Document number 1 is an interim report by Price Waterhouse on the audit for 1989, and it is a report dated 17 November 1989, which was the precursor to the final audit report coming in, and that is document number 1. Document number 2 is a letter or memorandum referencing the task force as a consequence of a meeting that you had with the partners of Price Waterhouse, and summarizing the events of 1990, during which time you set out the goals of your task force, the investigative task force, in order to try to determine what had happened to BCCI. Document number 3 is a private and confidential report by Price Waterhouse dated 14 March 1990, which was submitted to BCCI, which was an update audit which began to show some of the problems that were taking place in BCCI. And document number 4 is a supplementary document to document 3, which is a supplementary briefing paper from the for your task force, which came from Price Waterhouse regarding the problems in the bank. Document number 5 is a letter which was given to the directors of the bank from Price Waterhouse, summarizing the problems that had been found as a consequence of their supplementary audit, and which I believe prompted you to decide that you were going to resign. And document number 6 is your task force report, the summary that you yourself put together with your investigative task force, in which you summarized the $850 million which was at risk on the Credit and Commerce American holdings, First American, the $800 million on the shareholder loans, which was all BCC, the $700 million on the Gokal shipping problems, the $100 million on the Grand Cayman miscellaneous, and subsequently the $500 million on the ICIC books, which is a separate entity that you're going to describe today. Document number 6B is, again, the task force follow-up report, which set out how you were going to ferret out the problems and correct these things for the bank and try to do some kind of workout that would keep the bank whole prior to the Bank of England's takeover. And document number 7 was a report to the directors by Price Waterhouse summarizing the problems as they had then been discovered, and this was in 1990, 18 April 1990, a year ago. All of this was known within the bank and to the directors. And document number 8 is a letter to the government of Abu Dhabi to inform the shareholders about the problem. And this was a letter that came from Price Waterhouse as a consequence of your joint effort. And finally, document number 9 is a letter to the regulators in Luxembourg, which was a summation of the same problem that had been summarized to the directors and summarized in the Price Waterhouse report. Now, those are the 9 operative documents, some of which we will be referring to in the course of your testimony here this morning. Now, I'd like to come back, if we can, to let me just ask you, Mr. Rahman, have I correctly summarized each of those documents?
Yes, you have.
Okay. And those are documents which you have provided this committee?
Well, these were provided copies, one to the lawyers and one to Fed and one to the district attorney's office. This appears to be a 4th copy.
Okay. But that is a copy that you recognize to be a
Yes.
true copy of the
Yes,
documents that you've seen
yes.
previously?
Yes, I've seen these previously.
And you recognize those to be the documents as I've described them?
Yes.
Okay. Now, if we could go back, again, just tracing the history, because I think it's very helpful in understanding the development of this bank and how it came to be known as it is today and to be in this problem. You were telling us that in 1972, you were not yet associated with BCCI. You had been working as a professional, as a technocrat, as you said, in Pakistan, East Pakistan. And you were summoned, I believe, to a meeting with a Mr. Abidi. Is that correct?
Well, as I said, I joined United Bank, and I was with United Bank from 1966 to 1974. In 1972, United Bank was nationalized along with all the other banks after the Bhutto government came. And at that time, most of the senior executives of the banks were removed by the government, and government nominees were sent to run the banks. I was requested to continue in United Bank by the new government-nominated president. And indeed, he gave me a very long lecture that we have seen through your life file, and your father was Chief Justice, and you should be in government sector. Why are you working in this one family business, etc., and so on and so forth. And now's your chance to do something worthwhile. So he put me on a committee to restructure banking in Pakistan and merge the various banks into lesser number of banks. And I worked on that committee for nearly a year. During that time, Mr. Abadi had been put under house arrest, detention in his house.
What was he under house arrest for?
Well, the government felt that some of the executives of the banking industry needed to be investigated. It would make, of course, a particular case for the government to have taken over the bank without compensation.
So the banks were nationalized?
Yes.
They took over the banks?
Yes.
And Mr. Abadi, who had been the head of one of these banks,
Yes.
was put under house arrest?
Right.
Okay.
So he was making efforts to meet me, and I was a bit hesitant because I am from East Pakistan, and I know that the Pakistan-East Pakistan situation was also very raw because of the Bangladesh matter. So I didn't want to breach any law of the country. But having avoided meeting him for several months, I finally felt that out of old loyalty and knowing him so many years, I should go and see him. So that's why I went to his house on a Sunday. And during this meeting...
Now this was while he was under house arrest?
Yes, I had to go to his house.
You registered with the police and the government
Yes, the police
authorities.
were around the house, and I had to register the car and the purpose of the visit. And I had no documents, so that was all right. And he explained to me at that meeting for the first time that he very much wanted to get together with some people like me and start a World Bank, a global bank for the third world. And obviously he had been sitting and thinking about it on his own for some time. And he explained that up to that stage in the early 70s, there are mostly national banks and savings banks. The few banks which are international are indeed the colonial banks from Britain, France, Germany, and latterly from America. So they were normally not international, they were really national banks of big national banks of countries which were international in network only. So he felt that if a genuinely global bank could be started, bridging all the third world countries and also bridging the first world, then it could be a unique banking structure which could be very, very useful socially and also very profitable. So I was a bit taken aback that at this stage he should think such big dreams, but he did. He's that sort of person. And I told him that, of course, if it ever materializes, I would certainly like to be a part of it. And he said, well, it's very close to materializing because Sheikh Zayed of Abu Dhabi has assured him that he will back such an organization. So it was in this way that in November 1972, BCCI was born. It was born in a very, very small size, $2.5 million capital.
$2.5 million capital.
Capital, that's all. And hardly 100 million in asset altogether. So it started with 4 country presence.
What countries were those?
The head office of that bank was put in Luxembourg. It had branches in London and Abu Dhabi and Lebanon. So it started in a very humble way, and in this 2.5 million, Bank of America took 30% share. So quite rightly, Sheikh Zayed had wanted an international bank to assist in this process, and that is how Bank of America came to be a partner in this project with 30% shares. I joined in early 74 when I finished with the government assignment of restructuring banks in Pakistan, and I went straight to Abu Dhabi, and I found that in fact, considering the very big bank I was running and the very good lifestyle I had in Pakistan, this bank had nothing. They had very tiny office, no accommodation, so we all had to share mess type flats. And we literally had to, in those days, there were not even footpaths in Abu Dhabi. There were just sand and a little tarmac roads and a few buildings. So with very, very little pay, I plunged into the bank, and I became again general manager for finance from day one. In this bank, Mr. Abadi explained that the founder group of executives and members should also be shareholders of this bank, and one day we may hold up to 30 or 40% of the bank. Now, considering at that time it had no value or it was too small, it didn't mean much to us, but at least it gave us something to work for ourselves. He said that after this abrupt nationalization, when we've lost everything, I don't want to face this, and you shouldn't face this ever again.
Were you given a contract?
No,
Were you
none of
given
us.
actual shares?
No, only verbal assurance.
And you were satisfied with that?
Yes, because we just sort of worked, as he said, we were like a family who was starting a family business, and we had a share in that bank. And so we all got into the job literally without contracts or without assurance.
You say we all. How many people were involved then?
I think maximum at the senior level of about 5 people.
And who were the 5 people?
Mr. Abadi himself, Mr. Naqvi, myself, Mr. Imtiaz Ahmed, IMTIAZ, and Mr. Anis, who has since died. That's about the senior level. And Mr. Shafi, SHAFI, he was a senior man. The others were medium level executives, including those who are now in charge, like Mr. Zafar Iqbal Chaudhry and Mr. Aizullah Chaudhry and these people. So maximum about 50 to 100 people were involved in the whole bank, from the highest to the lowest level. So we did believe that we would have a share in the bank also. Of course, we had no real dream how big this bank will be and where it will go, because it was all theoretical. At that time, soon after formation of the bank, it started as BCCI SA, which is the Luxembourg bank. But within a couple of years, Mr. Abadi decided to restructure it, and a holding company was produced. It was called BCCI Holdings. And the bank underneath it, BCCI SA, was split into 2 parts. One bank was left as head office in Luxembourg, called BCCI SA, and another bank was created with its head office in Grand Cayman. The BCCI SA bank was mostly with European and Middle East locations, and BCC Overseas Bank was mostly third world countries.
Okay, so let's just understand this as we go along. In 1974 or 75? 1975, you decided, Mr. Abedi decided to restructure the bank.
Yes.
A holding company was created.
Yes, sir.
The holding company was BCCI Holdings.
Right.
Underneath the holding company, which was based in Luxembourg,
Yes.
underneath the holding company based in Luxembourg were created 2 banking entities. One of them, the overseas banking entity based in Grand Cayman,
Yes.
for a third world, so to speak,
Yes.
and the other was the BCCI SA,
Yes.
based in Luxembourg.
Yes.
And those were the only entities.
Those were the only entities.
But quickly, another entity was created called ICIC, was it not?
Yes. Around about the same time, 75, 76, in order to hold the shares of the founder group and other senior executives, an entity was set up called ICIC Holdings.
What did that stand for?
Investment, credit and commerce, something like that. I didn't know the full detail. ICIC, everybody refers to it as ICIC. That was set up in Grand Cayman with the apparent purpose of holding the shares for the founder group.
Now, the apparent purpose, you were told by Mr. Abedi, was that ICIC would be the pot of gold, so to speak, for all of you.
All the founder members, and later on for the general staff also.
Okay. Did you actually receive shares with respect to ICIC?
No, sir.
You were one of the 5 founding members of BCC, correct?
Yes.
Were you made a trustee of ICIC?
No, indeed, this in retrospective is very surprising, but Mr. Abedi decides who will be in what position. I mean, he had that sort of a personality and that sort of authority. So he rightly or wrongly selected all my other colleagues except myself as a trustee and as directors of the ICIC group of companies.
Now, which colleagues were those at that point in time?
There were about 7 altogether who were there. Mr. Naqvi was there, Mr. Imtiaz Ahmed was there, Mr. Anis was there, and Mr. Sadiq Ali, who's also died since then, and Mr. Salim Siddiqui, who came after me, and Mr. Amir Siddiqui also, who came after me, Mr. Iqbal Rizvi, who came after me. So they were the senior most executives of the bank who were holding divisional head positions. The organization of the bank was very unique in the sense that we had Mr. Abedi as the president, who had supreme authorities and rights. For all external matters, he handled affairs, which was non-banking.
Now, when you say external matters,
In the sense of going to countries, meeting government people, which is not related to the bank's operation as such. So he was the PR and the creator of relationships.
did he also manage the relationship with respect to the purchase, the secret purchase of banks in the United States?
Yes, sir.
He did.
Yes.
And who else was involved with him in the management of that U.S. relationship?
I think maximum 2 or 3 other executives. Mr. Naqvi would be involved. And for a small period, Mr. Kamal Shoaib, S-H-O-A-I-B, Mr. Shoaib. And Mr. Rizvi, Mr. Dildar Rizvi, R-I-Z-V-I.
Was anybody else involved to your knowledge?
Not to my knowledge. I mean, it was kept as a very isolated activity, not in the mainstream of the bank at all. So we were not
You were not
involved in
privy
any-
to it.
Not privy to this.
But you knew, did you not, just to jump ahead for a moment, but you knew that there was a relationship in the United States?
In the sense that when we had conferences of BCC in various countries, delegates from National Bank of Georgia and delegates from First America used to come to those conferences.
What do you mean by delegates?
Banking officials from those organizations.
Can you be more specific?
Well, from First America, both Mr. Clifford and Clark Clifford and Mr. Altman, along with Mr. Khusru Karamat Ali, and one or two.
Along with what? I'm sorry.
Ali, E-L-L-E-Y. And 1 or 2 other executives came from Bank of First America.
Now, when you say a conference, can you, well, I don't want to jump that far ahead. I'm going to wait. We'll come back to that. Let's come back, if we can, to the stay consecutive here. So Mr. Abedi was handling the American side, and
Yes.
he was principally the front person for the bank.
Front person, in the sense of any high-level contacts, he would make those contacts himself. And Mr. Naqvi,
Now, as the bank grew, that changed, did it not?
yes, in the sense that in an operational sense, in a banking operation sense, various executives had 2 roles. One was that they had a functional role as head of inspection or head of credit or head of finance like myself, head of automation, head of personnel. But they also had a side role that 1 or 2 countries were allocated for them to oversee. just to keep them in touch with the functions of the bank at the field level. So in that capacity, I also had the role of as head of finance, plus 3 countries I was associated with, that was Egypt, Ghana, and Spain. Like that, different executives had different countries allocated to them to oversee.
As time went on and the bank grew considerably, I mean, give us a sense. So you started out as a $2.5 million
Yes.
capitalization and $100 million in assets.
Yes.
Approximately, 1974. By 1980, how big was the bank?
By 1980, it was nearly 10 billion, or about $8 billion. $8
$8 billion.
Yes.
So it went from $2.5 million to $8 billion in the span of 8 years.
Yes, and capital of about 600 billion.
Okay.
So the growth of the bank during that time.
And during that growth, if I could just interrupt you, during that time, I gather you hired a lot of people, many of whom were not experienced in banking. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And they were given a certain free lead, were they not?
Yes, sir.
So, for instance, a relationship with a General Noriega was entered into by Mr. Abedi or by someone with some enterprising energy
Yes, I
at the
think
local
it was
level?
at a lower level. The basic technique of the operation evolved was that Mr. Abedi wanted the senior people, the more experienced people, to be in the head office to look after credit or treasury or risk areas. But where it came to external development or marketing, he preferred much younger officers. He felt that they had much more vibrant abilities, and they could work longer hours, they could move about far, they were not tied to family situations, etc., etc. And so
They also were less accountable, were they not?
Well, because they never got an all-round banking training in the sense that the senior bankers got. They were taken very raw and relatively ripe with few years banking and put into country positions.
Well, isn't it unusual to take people without banking experience and put them in charge of a bank in a country or a branch?
The number one man would normally be about 8 to 10 years experience, but the immediate other officials in the bank, in the branch or in the country bank would be quite new with 3 years, 4 years experience.
Would you describe for us, Mr. Rahman, the structure of the bank as it grew sort of towards
Well,
1980?
As I said that first in the personnel structure, I start to explain that there was Mr. Abedi at the very top. There was Mr. Naqvi, who was like a chief operating officer who converted Mr. Naqvi Abedi's ideas and things into practical shapes. And then there was a big gap between these two and the other executives who were all called general managers. All of us were called general managers. And each of us were sort of indicated that we should all work in our own respective areas. And if you try to encroach into another one's area, it was deemed that you are being aggressive, you want to promote yourself. And so every executive just tried to keep to his functional division. And if from my accounts department, if I tried to send some of my staff across to credit division or to the inspection division, immediately I would get a feedback that that was not liked, and why was my staff over there in the other division. So this is something that Mr. Abdi and Mr. Naqvi propagated also, which allowed them to deal with heads of division one-to-one. And therefore you had a flat surface with lots of direct lines to Mr. Naqvi, and everybody else kept to a Chinese wall isolation in their own respective area. When this type of structure was growing, I was very uncomfortable, because in PIDC days in the government, I could go across board and go to any division and see any of the operation. But here I could see these Chinese walls were getting very, very watertight, and we were always talked about humility and ego, and anything that was slightly out of context was considered just an ego trip, trying to propagate yourself or project or become senior to everybody else. You shouldn't be senior to anybody else. You're all the same pay, same benefit, same title.
And what was your pay at this point in time?
My pay had started very low at about $18,000 and went up to about $120,000. So over the period. In pounds, sorry, in pound.
In pounds. So
Yes,
you were
in
earning
pounds.
about $300,000 to $400,000?
$120,000 is about $220,000.
$220,000.
Yes. At the end of my career, yes.
Okay.
And now the other situation was that realizing this, the way it was structured at the head office, and then they created many regions, about 13, 14 regions, and there was a regional structure with a very senior banker in the region. They also became like in charge of the empire, and your trying to go too much into their area was also not liked. You literally had to have.
What was the impact? You've described this as sort of a free-floating management style. Is that
Yes.
accurate?
Right.
What was the impact of that kind of management structure?
Well, the impact was that the level of control required from head office was obviously missing. And Mr. Abdi and Mr. Naqvi and others would say that, well, all the results and all the growth of the bank is in the field. It is they who produce the results. It's they who produce the profits. What can you do sitting in London? So leave them alone. So that was propagated in the bank in order to give more power and more authority to each regional head, who again preferred to relate to Mr. Naqvi and to Mr. Abdi, both for their own career and to show that they are superior to head office executives.
What was the effect of having the bank split into two entities, one based in Grand Cayman and one based in Luxembourg?
Well, the more number of entities there are in any organization, obviously the more isolation you can put each section to. And if you do an intercompany position, then unless you know both companies' position, you could get half a picture. So there was that situation also.
And who had the whole picture?
The whole picture Mr. Naqvi would put together in terms of the underlying activity and underlying clientele names and relationships. He had the best global picture. In a pure accounting sense, when the figures are put together, I had a picture because all the audited cassettes used to come to me and I used to put them on computer for consolidation.
But what you would do, I understand, is take the audited cassettes.
Yes.
The auditing done separately.
Yes.
It wasn't your audit, it
No.
was someone else auditing.
This
And you
is-
would draw your picture of the financial structure, would you not, from the audits that you were provided? Is that correct?
Right, sir. In fact, I was going to say that because I realized the danger of this evolving structure and the management style, I insisted that we have the best and biggest auditors. And so we, from the early days, had two of the biggest audit firms, Ernst & Winnie, which became Ernst & Young, and Price Waterhouse.
Now, one of them, who was the auditor for BCCI Luxembourg?
In the early days, both the holding company and the other banks, other than BCC Overseas, was done by Ernst & Winnie. And from the very beginning, BCC Overseas was done by Price Waterhouse. So one of the flag bank was done by Price Waterhouse, and the other flag bank and other subsidiary banks were done by Ernst & Winnie.
What was the effect of having two auditors auditing separate entities of the bank?
Well, as far as the individual banks are concerned, they are an entity in itself. The 32 other small banks, they were all audited independently, and they were audited and certified by the local auditors and overseen by Ernst & Winnie. Pricewaterhouse did the audit of Grand Cayman and all the branches of the Grand Cayman Bank. At the end of this period, which took a long period from, it was more or less continuous from September all the way to February, we had 2 audits each year, one based on the September position for 9 months, and one based on the December position, which was done in January and February. So we gave full authority and access to these audit firms, and we are indeed towards the end paying $4 million a year in audit fees.
Now, at some point, did Pricewaterhouse become auditor for the entire bank?
Yes.
At what year was that?
This happened in 1985. We had a tremendous disaster in Treasury. And I was going to come to that, but soon after that, and all this disaster happened right under the nose of Pricewaterhouse, who were auditing both the Grand Cayman Bank and the Treasury division of the Grand Cayman Bank, which was a division of the bank.
Let me just step back for 1 minute.
Yes.
What was attractive? Why locate in Grand Cayman? What was attractive feature about that?
Well, the rationale given at that time was that in taxation terms, the tax laws were such that besides paying tax in each country from the profits of the country's results, any profit remitted to head office in Luxembourg got taxed again. So we were suffering 2-tier taxes, one at the location which was quite high, and then when the profits were brought to Luxembourg, it got taxed again. So by having one of the bank's head office in Grand Cayman, this 2-level tax was avoided, and only the tax of the country concerned was there, and Grand Cayman did not put any supplementary tax on it.
Okay.
But in reality, what happened is that the tax of each of the third world country was so high that it didn't make any real sense of what was left of the profit at Grand Cayman. And Grand Cayman itself, which was supposed to be a profit center, became a major loss center. So it did not have any tax-free profit at all.
There were also benefits, were there not, with respect to regulation? Regulation's
Yes,
not
in
very
terms
stiff,
of
correct?
regulation also, because of the evolving Basel Conference and others, it was seen that the regulation requirements were very stiff in the European context. Grand Cayman had a small regulatory agency, though controlled by Bank of England, and there was obviously more flexibility in record keeping in Grand Cayman.
Now, Mr. Rahman, here's the bank steaming along, doing very well, going from 2.5 million up to 8 billion. Get into the 1980s, got this freewheeling regulatory structure, freewheeling management structure, a lot of money coming across the transom, and all of a sudden, 1985, big losses, correct?
Yes, sir.
Trouble on the horizon.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
Would you describe the 1985 trouble?
As I was explaining that because of this freewheeling structure, I had particularly instructed the partners of both Pricewaterhouse and Ernst & Young that if ever anything out of context was found in the course of their audit, they must inform me and not wait for the normal audit process or end of the year audit. And in a few cases, they would bring such incidents, and I would take immediate retroactive action on that. On that basis, we had also a very powerful internal audit division, which was set up by Bank of America, indeed, in the early 70s. And this division was the most fair division of the bank, because they had over 200 inspectors going around the world spontaneously without notice, very short notices, doing intensive investigative audit of our own operation. And their reports were very, very comprehensive. They were in 3 parts. There was a part dealing with the credit, which is the risk area of the bank, all the loans and advances and documentation. There was an area about the operational deficiencies, in terms of any defects in the operation. And then there was a confidential third part which talked about individuals in that location and their lifestyle. The purpose of such a part, third part, was to see whether the officers and executives in the field were apparently living within their means and having a lifestyle which could be explained by the nature of their job and the seniority of their job. So every executive around the world, every officer dreaded the inspection division, and it was headed by a very, very powerful gentleman called Mr. Salim Siddiqui.
Called Mr. what?
Salim Siddiqui, S-A-L-E-E-M S-I-D-D-I-Q-U-I. And it was said quite knowingly in the bank that he used to also keep a black book for himself, where he noted special things for use in due course. So I tried many times to have access to that, but the instruction to Mr. Siddiqui was they are only meant for the board, those reports, and to the general manager in control of that area, not meant for any central figure like myself. So I used to tell the PricewaterhouseCoopers that please review these reports, and also please keep me informed, because you are more my eyes and ears than my own inspection division.
Did they in fact review those reports?
I think that was a part of their audit process. I don't know how much was shown to them. I mean, that I don't know how much was shown to them, and whether the edited version or the real full version, what was shown to them. But between these two levels of inspection, I was expecting that every year what would come to me would be the certified audited accounts from which I built up the balance sheet. Coming to 1985-86, what had happened in the early 80s, Mr. Naqvi and Mr. Abadi persuaded the board that there's substantial dollar surpluses from the Arab world coming into the bank, and we needed now to pool it in a central place rather than leave it in 5, 6, 8, 10 countries. And so these surplus dollars should be pooled under one control situation for better liquidity management and for better management control.
These dollars were coming from where?
Mostly from the Arab world, most of them from the Arab world, some from Africa, Asia. And
so they wanted to put these dollars into one central location.
Yes, and monitor it through a central treasury division which they established in Grand Cayman. Now, this division was manned by 4 or 5 people only, under Mr. Ziauddin Akbar, Z-I-A-U-D-D-I-N A-K-B-A-R.
Say that again?
Ziauddin Akbar.
Akbar.
A-K-B-R.
And did this group have anything to do with ICIC?
No.
All right.
The ICIC was run completely independently and separately. I'll come back to that.
Now, did these dollars somehow come to be played in the commodities market?
Yes. The board, after reviewing this proposal, they laid down very strict regulation regarding how it was to be used. And they laid down that the bulk of it would be used for liquidity management by placing it with other prime banks or buying US government stocks or treasury notes and UK government stocks, gilts, etc. And a small amount, less than 10%, was to be used for trading.
For trading in commodities?
Commodities, foreign exchange, even bonds.
With an agreement that the exposure of the bank would go up to $100 million, is
yes,
that correct?
No, the guidelines were that the maximum loss that Treasury should ever have is 100 million. That was what the bank felt it could ever sustain. Not that they wanted to lose 100 million, but that's the maximum cutoff point.
In point of fact, how much did the bank wind up losing?
Now, in order to, just to give you an idea, in order to lose 100 million on a 10% margin, it means that the bank could expose itself, gross exposure of about $1 billion. So these were the guidelines on which it was working. Indeed, what happened is that in the mid-85s, the chief treasurer and his assistant along with Mr. Naqvi's guidance, started taking very, very large exposures, and this was going on simultaneous to the interim audit which Pricewaterhouse people were doing at the time. Pricewaterhouse used to come in immediately after September 9-month closing and literally live till mid-December, and then with a brief break over Christmas and New Year's would come back again for the final. So it was a constant process of audit. I met God knows how many dozen partners and managers all over the building, and they had free access to go, including to the Treasury Division. The Treasury Division was physically located in London, though the booking was going on in Grand Cayman Books. So it was easy enough to meet the officers concerned, and the Pricewaterhouse team used to go and talk to them and see their records.
Well, what are
and
you
books.
saying? What's the bottom line there with respect to the loss of
What I'm
commodities?
saying is that if the guidelines had been maintained and Pricewaterhouse had been doing anywhere near their job, there is no way that this $1 billion exposure, which was taken to $11 billion exposure in the course of 3-4 months, could have happened. $11 billion exposure
So
was
11
taken.
times the exposure
The
level.
exposure
that
level. And this was done by not more than 2 or 3 of the executives in the Treasury Division, directly under Mr. Naqvi. And the reason why this was being done is that they were in total breach of a basic policy in trading, Treasury trading, and that is that when you receive a premium for an open position for a forward contract, that premium is a reserve for settlement when the contract matures. But they were using this premium as if it was income and booking it through as income.
This was sort of the beginning of a Ponzi scheme.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Exactly. And every time it became a loss, they would have to take a larger position. And we also found in retrospective, when I did my inquiry subsequent to the disaster, that they had also set up an intermediary company called Capcom, and many of the Capcom, C-A-P-E-C-O-M, in which Mr. A.R. Khalil, who was a shareholder of the bank, was also a shareholder of that company. And it is said that Ziauddin Akbar himself had interest. I don't know who else had interest. So many of the trades were being put through that company. Now, considering that
This is what year?
this is still going on through 84, 85.
84, 85.
Yes. And considering that Pricewaterhouse had not only their
Mr. Khalil, as you describe him, is he a shareholder in BCCI?
he's deemed to be a shareholder in BCCI.
What does deemed to be mean?
Because subsequently, in Pricewaterhouse's report, which I'll refer to, they have said that for several years they have not been in touch with him, and we don't know what his status is, and whether he's left or whether he was ever there.
What's his relationship to the bank?
Well, he has been very close to the bank, at least his name has been very close to the bank in terms of being a shareholder of the bank and also a shareholder of CCH First America. So in that
A
capacity.
shareholder of CCH First American.
Yes.
Was he somebody who you came to understand was a convenient purchaser of stock and somebody in whose name shares moved back and forth from one entity?
Well, in the investigation I carried out in March, April of 1990, which I'll refer to later, we concluded that we could not be certain about the status of A.R. Khalil, but effort should be made to find A.R. Khalil and get his documentation done. If
Have you
there
ever
was-
met him?
I've never met him.
Has anybody ever met him?
I don't know.
Is he a real person?
I don't know.
Could he not be a real person?
Could be.
Have you heard that?
I read that in some papers and things afterwards, but I mean,
You
considering
don't know the answer.
I don't know the answer.
Excuse me?
I don't know the answer to that.
But that same Khalil to whom you're referring was made a substantial shareholder in the First American Bank, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
But you don't know who he is?
No, I don't know.
No background?
He's
No-
supposed to be a high net worth man from Saudi Arabia, and that's about all that was ever referred.
Okay. Returning now to the 1984-85 transactions, prior to these losses, had the bank been incurring losses through any other schemes that you knew of?
No. Indeed, till this year, every year had been a financially good year, and this is why I'm very depressed to read allegation that the bank was not in profit. I mean, the business of the bank grew, the deposits of the bank grew, and indeed, because of the network of the bank, its trading business, it became known as the trading bank of the world, one of the trading banks of the world. And in banking terms, there is substantially more banking income for doing trading business because of the commission and foreign exchange earnings that you get from international trade compared to just personal loans, which has a fixed return, etc. So everybody who knows banking would say that it'd be far better to spread your activity not in fixed-term loans with differentials, but to add on by actually associating in the business in terms of commission and exchange income.
So the bank was going for bucks, bigger bucks, faster profit.
Yes, I mean, but I mean, trading is not something nasty and wrong in the first instance. And many banks do trading.
No, but it's a question of who's doing it, isn't it?
Well, by the last year that I was there, the bank was doing about $18 billion worth of global trade. Considering that global trade is over $3 trillion, that's not a big sum, but it was a very big sum for an 18-year-old bank. And that was a very big source of its international income.
Now, prior, so it's your testimony that in 1984 and 85, this is the first loss that you became aware of?
Yes, well, 85, 86, 84, they started the activity in this manner.
And 85 and 86, it was
yes,
loss.
The loss.
Now
and that loss, Price Waterhouse, again, what happened is that they did not find this loss in the September audit. And again, December audit was complete for the rest of the world when they informed me suddenly, the partners, that they have come across these irregular transactions in Treasury which will lose between 300 and 500 million, which was equivalent to the whole capital of the bank. So I was stunned that they should tell me late in January that something of this nature has happened. I said, these must be going on for months together, if not years. What happened? And they fudged and they fummed and they said, well, and I said,
you say they fudged.
They never gave me a good explanation as to why they didn't find it before. I said, look, the department has hardly 10 people. It has maybe 100 files, and they're all sitting in one small section of one floor. And all this is happening over there. We are supposed to get confirmatory certificates from the counterparties, and the counterparties were all top names like Goldman Sachs, Salomon Brothers, and all these big names. I said, how can you have been auditing this and not knowing that such positions are being taken? The technique of auditing Treasury is well established. It's not new. I mean, it's new to those who don't know how to do it, but it's very well established. And they had special Treasury-related audit experts who were doing the Treasury audit.
Now, just to be clear here, at this point in time, these losses were incurred under which company? The overseas?
Under overseas
under
head
overseas
office.
Entity.
Head office, Grand Cayman, yes.
And to this point, ICIC didn't figure into this?
Not as yet. ICIC is a parallel situation. I'll come back to that.
It's a parallel situation.
Completely parallel to the bank.
ICIC is what we would call the bank within the bank. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. I will come back to that just now.
Okay. Now, let me just understand for the record here. The impact of these losses of some, was it 400 million?
430 million.
430 million. The impact of the loss was to wipe out BCCI's capital, was it not?
Yes.
Effectively.
Yes.
So here's a bank sitting here, suddenly stripped of its capital,
right,
and deeply entwined with a number of people who had big loans but weren't paying them and possibly weren't capable of paying them, correct?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, so what was the next step?
Well, they insisted that they could only certify the accounts after we close out the positions, and we were very, upset that if you close these positions very abruptly, you lose even more. But they were not willing to wait to close on due dates. So we lost over 430 million in this.
Well, now, in fairness, that was a good call by Price Waterhouse.
It was. It had to be done. But there are mechanics, if anybody understands Treasury, of doing proper closing. You can buy, rebuy, resell, forward contract, instead of just abruptly saying, I cut. The moment you cut, the market responds and they take a harder position on you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the whole of Chicago and New York must have been horrified that this little bank had taken this sort of position and was closing up. So anyway, so at that time we were literally stripped of capital. Mr. Abadi went to Abu Dhabi apparently to try and salvage something from Sheikh Zayed and all. And the next I knew is that 150 million was being raised to compensate for this. And this arrived quite abruptly, 150 million, and I was thinking the general news was it was coming from Sheikh Zayed or somebody from Abu Dhabi. But I pressed Price Waterhouse if they were aware how this was happening, because they were on an ongoing basis watching the situation. And indeed, Ernst and many partners had got in the act. Their experts had come because effectively the whole group was finished. And so Ernst got very, very upset that one bank in the group had caused the whole group to go down. And earlier also they wanted to be auditors of all the banks, but somehow overseas remained with Price Waterhouse.
Now let me ask you at this point, Mr. Rahman, we're into 1986. Previously, in the early years of the 1980s, were there not some accusations about the bank having been involved in some irregularities in some of the markets in Europe?
The one-off irregularities that used to come, whether in Sudan or Egypt or India, used to be separately investigated by the inspection division, and sometimes I would get involved to understand the financial implication. But these were 90% of the time related to foreign exchange related transactions, because in most third world countries the foreign exchange regulations are very tight, and the moment the regulation become tight, a secondary market operates and different values begin to quote itself in currencies. So sometimes the manager would get involved in some irregularities in relation to foreign exchange transactions, and we in most cases would want to either sack the man straight away or suspend him or bring him to head office in a non-field job so that he cannot be in the field doing any transactions of his own.
Now there's a memo that was written in this country by the CIA around 1986 which already had a reference to BCCI as the Bank of Crooks and Criminals. You've heard of that memo, have you not,
I've heard
in recent days?
Subsequently even more, but when you have 1.3 million customers in 73 countries and the customers use any name or any company name, it would be, unless you're directly involved in creating that account, nobody would ever get to know what that account was and what was the nature of the transaction in the account. If at all, the local general manager or the local country manager may know, and somebody in head office also may get to know, but it would be not normal for a global bank with 1.3 million customers to relate to this account. I mean, as recently,
is it not fair to say, and I'm not, believe me, I'm not trying, and I don't want to, and I'm sure I can't put words in your mouth, but you've described a structure that's pretty loose management structure.
Yes.
You've got a lot of young people out there who don't have banking experience. We've all seen, and in recent years we're learning a lot more about the problems of banks. And we've had very known banks of high reputation and standing that have had problems with money laundering in this country, knowingly.
Yes.
So it is clear that the notion in the banking industry, know your customer,
yes.
You're familiar with it,
Yes,
correct?
sir.
That's the Basel Convention
Yes.
adopted principle of banking, is it not?
Yes, sir.
Know your customer.
Yes, sir.
And in point of fact, it's fair to say that that is not a principle that has been really applied very strictly by many banks in the world, is it? Is that accurate?
Well, I believe that
or did
most
they
banks
know General Noriega and like it?
When we come to these sort of names, it's very difficult for a bank who has entered a country for commercial business, and there are hundreds of banks entering countries for commercial business, to know what the president of the country, or how important or how bad or how good he is. I don't think banks go into countries with moral issues in mind to safeguard the country from immoral leaders. If every bank is following a leader, then knowing that leader perhaps is deemed creditable. As I will come to Panama and Noriega again later on, I will expound on this a bit more.
Okay.
But coming back to the Treasury, because it is such an important event in the life of the bank, that I think it has singed the bank, and the bank has really never fully recovered from such a heavy loss. But coming to the 150 million, I pressed Price Waterhouse to try and explain, and they explained that the trustees of the staff benefit fund, and here is where ICIC is coming in, has contributed this from the staff benefit fund. And this was shocking news in the sense that in a normal situation, if a bank faces a crisis of this type, there is a standard process to be followed. And that is that the directors would be informed. The directors would then inform the shareholders, full facts, and give the choice to the shareholders all that either you close this bank or you recapitalize the bank. And the choice is very easy, that they have to issue new capital. Now the option...
Did that take place here? Was
nothing like
notified?
this. Nothing like
place.
this happened.
Nothing took place.
Nothing was done.
Now the exposure you're talking about, am I correct that at this point in time, in 1985 or 6, you had 275 million to the Gokal Shipping Group
there were large loans, I would not recall, but these clients were all there. The ones which you see in 1989-90 were already there in 1985-86, but figures may have been substantially smaller. But the names were similar.
This is later. Okay, all right. Were you concerned about the possibility of a run on the bank at this particular moment in time?
It was kept an incredible secret. Not more than 4 or 5 people knew what had happened, because it had happened in a very specialist area, not affecting the commercial banking around the world.
Because it was this unique
it was a unit,
set aside.
Exactly. It is a small unit under 10, 12 people, directly under the chief executive.
Okay.
And so there was hush-hush talk that there had been some loss. We heard that there's some loss, but nobody guessed how big and nobody knew why. And it was isolated from the rest of the bank totally. The rest of the bank was audited, closed, certified, everything. So it wasn't anything to do with the bank. So anyway, in retrospective, I felt that the reason why the board and others had agreed, and the rationale given was the bank was collapsing anyway, and the staff would have lost their job anyway, and their savings would have gone anyway. So you might as well use some of this to try and salvage the bank, which I suppose in a very broad commercial sense, moral sense, made meaning, but it did not follow the technical steps.
So who bailed out the bank? There was no technical process implemented to deal with this, but the bank got bailed out.
150 million of it got bailed out.
Only 150 million.
150 million.
And that was bailed out partly from ICIC?
No, wholly from ICIC.
Only ICIC.
Wholly ICIC. From the staff benefits part of ICIC, there are different parts of ICIC, I'll explain that.
From the staff benefit side.
Fund.
Now, at this point in time, you still understood ICIC to be the golden nest egg for you people who had been in the bank early.
Exactly.
And for employees. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Okay. Now, what happened after the $150 million came forward?
Well, I was then informed. I pressed Mr. Abadi and he said, yes, we've done it, but don't worry, more is coming from other shareholders, and you'll soon see a complete revival, and we will have more capital and more shareholders, very heavyweight. And indeed, soon after that, the very powerful Saudi group, Khalid bin Mahfouz, who were one of the richest group in Saudi Arabia, who owned National Commercial Bank, which is the biggest bank of Saudi Arabia, took up a very big chunk of the bank.
How much?
They had a right to go up to 30% of the bank. And they also gave capital notes of about 300-400 million, which was redeemable into capital after so many years. So that genuinely gave the bank a new lease of life and a new strength, because up to then, most of the capital was from Abu Dhabi, which meant you were loading yourself on a single country rather than spreading it out. And this brought a very major shareholder from Saudi Arabia, which is much, much bigger than UAE. So we managed to live out 85, 86, and we continued to have a fairly good growth till 1988, and then we have the situation with the drug.
Situation with the drugs?
With the drugs.
You're referring to Florida now.
Florida case. Now here again, I must again explain the structure of the bank, that each area was allocated to some general manager, and he was like a regular mother hen to that and would not like interference from other executives. And if anything had to be discussed by him, he wouldn't think it worthy to discuss with another general manager, but only with the president. So he would only take it to the president or deal with it himself. So the general manager for USA, who was originally Mr. Shoaib, was at that time Mr. Amir Siddiqui, AMEER-SIDDIKI.
He was based where?
He was based in London, but overseeing the whole of the Americas. And he was assisted during that time by Mr. Rizvi, Mr. Dildar Rizvi, DILDR-RIZVI. So they alone oversaw the operation. We had also a very senior banker, Mr. Shafi, who was based in Miami. And we had a very senior assistant, Mr. Sakhia, S-A-K-H-I-A, also assisting him in Miami. So there were enough executives overseeing what was then not a very big operation at all. It was a fairly small operation by the total global size.
What did you understand the BCCI operation in the United States to be then?
Just that we had started 4 or 5 operation, 4 of them as OBUs, meaning you can do foreign business and you can bring foreign deposits. You could lend locally, but you couldn't raise money locally. And all the money had to come from Middle East, from Latin America or somewhere else, but it could be lent either abroad or it could be lent locally. So this limited the risk for the US citizens. And we had such an operation in New York, in Florida, in Los Angeles, and in San Francisco. We also had a few rep offices in Houston and Chicago and Washington.
Now, is that your full understanding?
That was our full, that was all that we consolidated, that's all that we audited, that's all that came into our balance sheet.
What about National Bank of Georgia, First American, and Encino?
No, it never came into our balance sheet. We didn't even, sometimes I never saw their balance sheet.
What was your understanding then of the so-called delegates who would meet at your conferences?
Yes, when they used to come, because there were some deputed officers from BCC who were seconded to these banks, they would come, plus some of the American senior executives would come, and they would talk about their operation and their success and how they're faring.
Why would they do that? What was the relevance of an American bank that had nothing to do with
I
BCCI?
think the brotherhood feeling remained, that they were all sort of brothers in the same process, and be it through common shareholding or...
Well, why wasn't somebody there from Citibank or First Bank of Boston or something? Why National Bank of Georgia?
Well,
Bank?
I mean, at least it was known that there were common shareholders owning both banks. At least that's the official version, very strongly propagated.
Okay, now I have here a BCC annual conference in Vienna, 1984, 26th to 27th of February. List of participants at the Hilton Intercontinental. The board of directors were there, including Mr. Abedi, a number of other people, and then various guests, a fairly significant group of guests from the National Bank of Georgia. This is in 1984. And then special invitees, including a Mr. Altman and a Mr. Eli, KK. Were you at that meeting in Vienna?
Yes, sir.
Do you recall that?
Yes, sir.
And what went on at that meeting?
These conferences...
Let me put this in the record as document number 10 this moment.
These conferences were really not at all banking in nature, in the sense that we never discussed concrete banking proposals or banking strategies or plans. They were really a get-together of colleagues of the world, hearing about some success stories in different parts of the world, and just philosophical matters. And Mr. Abedi held the stage for the bulk of the time, and he talked about abstract subjects, about totality and the role of a growing organization in change, in the process of change. So while it was a good break from our work and a good way to say hello to many of our friends whom we otherwise didn't meet from the field, it had no commercial purpose at all.
At any of the conferences that you attended, did Mr. Altman ever make a presentation at any of those?
I can't recall. I don't think so.
Did any banking officials from the National Bank of Georgia make presentations?
Yes, they made several presentations.
Would those have been presentations by Mr. Roy Carlson?
Yes.
And by Mr. Tariq Jamil?
Yes.
And he was president, is that correct?
Yes.
Now, coming back, you were describing the beginning of the drug problem and the structure as we were going down to Miami in 1988, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right.
We were having one of our smaller conferences where about 100 delegates come from different parts, which is somewhat more concrete in terms of programs for the next so many months, etc. And we had delegates from all over the world, including from America. And during the Sunday conference, or Saturday conference, one of the weekend conference dates, we heard that some of our staff had been arrested in Tampa in relation to drugs. I assure you that 90%, if not 95% of us were shocked, because A, we didn't know what drug was in our banking term. We didn't know or understand what this money laundering was. These are all events which we have learned very intimately in the last 4 or 5 years. Prior to that, it was not even a subject which ever was discussed at any conference or any discussion or any small meeting that I have been there. The rationale that was given to us of the episode was that a very young officer who had never been in banking but was related to Mr. Akbar in Grand Cayman had been holding a green card here, doing odd jobs, had tried to enter BCCI in Miami, had not succeeded, and he was taken by Mr. Akbar and put in Panama directly. Now here you have a totally raw man entering banking directly under an overview of one of his relatives who happens to be in Grand Cayman. And in Panama, lifestyle being...
This is the same Mr. Akbar who had invested money in the commodities loss.
No, that's a different Akbar, Mr. S.M. Akbar. He's a completely different man.
Completely different.
Different man.
And
he's in charge of Grand Cayman operation. He was based in Grand Cayman.
Fine. And the Mr. Akbar that you referred to who invested the money in the commodities.
Yes, sir.
Did that Mr. Akbar personally profit from BCCI's $400 million loss?
Well, the more I looked into it, the more incredible it appeared that the transactions that were being booked had no commercial sense, and they were literally going way out of the market direction and expectations. And the further out of the market you go, the bigger is the premium that you receive. And he was taking positions on silver and on 20-year bonds, suggesting that 20-year bonds would be 7% or 6.8% and things like that, which anybody who understands Treasury knows that how deeply discounted it would be if you project that sort of thing for 20 years. And yet he was taking those sort of positions for premium.
Did Mr. Naqvi profit from the loss?
Somebody has profited a lot. Somebody has profited, and since only 2-3 people are involved, I can only allude.
Was Mr. Akbar fired after he lost the $400 million?
He was released. Fired would suggest a very serious term, but he was released gently. And as far as I know, he even took his company car and other benefits. And later on, his company was even given a credit line. Capcom was given an official credit line.
So
by
he
BCCI.
went to Capcom.
He went
but
to
Capcom was a piece of the bank, was it not?
Capcom was a separate trading brokerage company set up by
the bank.
By Mr. A.R. Khalil and Mr. Akbar and by Mr. Ziauddin Akbar and others. So he was a shareholder. He then declared himself to be an official shareholder of Capcom.
And he continued with Capcom after formally leaving the association.
Yes, he went
with the
straight
bank.
there. Yes.
All right. And what did you learn later about Capcom?
Well, to start with, it was quite clear that many of the transactions which the bank was apparently doing was being routed through Capcom, who obviously was scaling out the differentials or much of the differentials themselves.
As Ben Hook said a week or so ago at the NAACP press conference about our willingness to make an all-out fight, a full-court press, I believe, was his words. And the reason everyone up here has spoken so passionately is because we do believe that Clarence Thomas must be defeated because of his record in judicial philosophy and where we are in this country with respect to civil rights, where the Supreme Court is, and what the dangers are. We honestly believe that another right-wing conservative in Clarence Thomas is firmly ensconced on the right wing of the Republican Party. We could lose overnight fundamental constitutional and civil rights. There are differences between Clarence Thomas and Robert Bork, one being over natural law, of course. But there are many similarities, and that is one reason we have to oppose Clarence Thomas. Let me go.
I'm sorry. I don't think it was answered. But do you think that Clarence Thomas's judicial philosophy is more dangerous to your agenda than Judge Bork's was?
Well, again, I don't think I can give you quite as clear an answer as you want. With Robert Bork, and some people forget this as to why Robert Bork was defeated, with all due respect to the Civil Rights Coalition and others, Robert Bork defeated Robert Bork. Robert Bork, over a period of quarter of a century, basically condemned every civil rights decision, virtually every civil rights decision, going back 60-something years. So there was a very clear record with how harshly he considered the major landmark decisions. With Clarence Thomas, there's a lot of that. There's certainly a lot of criticism of major civil rights decisions. There's a public record at EEOC and education that distinguishes him from the Bork record. And then there are some judicial philosophical views, like on natural law, that separate the two. So I guess the bottom line is that in both cases, we strongly oppose those nominations, sometimes for very similar reasons and sometimes for some different reasons. Yes, sir.
Despite the opposition of your group and a growing number of groups, the White House is counting on losing perhaps only one Republican, Packwood of Oregon, when the vote comes around, and several Democrats have already said favorable things about Thomas, including Southern Democrats. How do you expect to tilt them against the nomination?
Joe Rao addressed this briefly by giving you a historical context, and as always, it was complete and accurate. There's always a presumption in favor of a presidential nomination, whether it be executive branch or judicial branch. But it is a rebuttable presumption. And let's face it, the odds usually are against us on so many of our campaigns. But many of the times, if not most of the times, we're able to bring together a coalition nationally and on Capitol Hill. As Joe said, just in the last few years, there was the Bork nomination. We could also think about the nominations of William Bradford Reynolds and William Lucas and Kenneth Reiskamp and Jeffrey Sessions and many others, where at the beginning they said you can't get more than 20 or 30 votes. It's impossible to defeat this nomination. It's not impossible to defeat this nomination. I believe that this first month has been pretty much a fluff campaign by the White House. You've had, understandably, the White House focusing on the personal history of Clarence Thomas, in refusing to focus on his judicial philosophy and on his record at EEOC and at the Department of Education. What we want to do over the next 6 weeks prior to the hearing is to refocus public attention, the press attention, and the Senate's attention on the facts. And we're convinced if people will listen, if people will study the facts, the Senate will not confirm Clarence Thomas. Let me go over to this other side. Yes?
If you were successful in defeating Judge Thomas, President Bush is almost certainly going to nominate somebody else who is also opposed to affirmative action, who is also opposed to abortion rights, and who has many of the same views as Judge Thomas, and who most likely will not have grown up poor and black for whatever lesson Judge Thomas may or may not have drawn from that. Are you prepared to wage a whole series of fights? How are things going to improve realistically given this president and the agenda of this administration?
I am not sure, of course, what President George Bush will do when Clarence Thomas is defeated. But I think Joe Rao and I, in my initial remarks, harken back to the nominations of Carswell and Hainsworth and ending up with Justice Blackmun. And I can assure you, if we have to, we will fight 2 or 3 or however many nominations we have to consider over the next few months or however long it's going to be. I believe that those of us in the civil rights community, those of us on Capitol Hill, Democrats as well as some Republicans, know what's at stake here. And I think that they have decided to draw the line in the sand. There's too much at stake for this country, and the Senate has a co-equal constitutional role with respect to judicial nominations. So I'm here to say to you today, and I think everyone up here has said to you today, that we're willing to fight as long and as hard as it takes to make sure that there is a justice who gets on the Supreme Court who has a demonstrated record of commitment to equal opportunity and to equal justice under the law. That's our bottom line. That's what we mean by a qualified nomination for the Supreme Court.
Robert,
yes, sir.
At the end of your list, at the end of your press release, you have a list of organizations that asked to be listed as dissenting from the decision. Did those same groups take the same position in the Bork case?
That note at the very last paragraph, I guess it is pretty much a boilerplate paragraph. They are pretty much the same organizations who want to be listed in any judicial or executive branch nomination battle because they historically usually don't take positions on nominations. So I would say 4 or 5 of those are just listed every time we do have one of these opportunities or when we have to oppose a judicial nomination. But let me just say there was a very strong consensus on the executive committee when we met on Monday, a very strong consensus on behalf of opposing this nomination. I think, Arch, you had said something before.
All right, what do you do now? Let's be more specific about what are your strategies now from this point. What do you do next?
I will not be so specific. Obviously, we have just, in the last 48 hours, arrived at a consensus within the leadership conference. And by the way, I think some people fail to remember the history of judicial nomination battles, and this is the usual time process that we take. On only 1 or 2 occasions can I think of where the entire coalition was able to take a consensus position against a nomination. It usually takes 4 or 5 or 6 weeks for the organizations to feel comfortable, to get their reports done, so that when they make a decision, they can cite chapter and verse. My guess is, Arch, over the next couple of days, those of us up here and many, many more are going to be sitting down and we're going to be talking about how we get this information out to our constituencies, to the press, to the public, most importantly, as far as votes go, to the Senate. But those decisions really have not been reached yet, but we will be addressing them over the next few days. Yes?
The fair can't matter a factor in the decision by the leadership conference to oppose Thomas?
That issue was not raised at the leadership conference executive committee meeting. Certainly a number of organizations have stated that they do want to look into that matter, that when it was first surfaced in the press, it did disturb them, and I'm sure that there will be a careful scrutiny of those issues. Alderman Corder?
In case he is confirmed, is there anything you like about Clarence Thomas?
Well, I've certainly shared with you the leadership conference position with respect to his judicial philosophy and to his record. I might add here that many of us up here have known Clarence Thomas. Most of you know that I'm a Republican and I worked for Edward W. Brooke, the only black elected senator in the history of the United States. And I was up in the Senate with Senator Brooke and Senator Durnberger during the 1970s. And near the late 1970s, I had an opportunity to meet Clarence Thomas professionally as a legislative assistant. And obviously, many of us up here have had an opportunity to work with him, sometimes against him, obviously, over the last 8 or 9 years. And I think all of us went through a great deal of anguish. Clarence Thomas and I and many people up here share many, many friends. And I think we've made it clear that this opposition has nothing to do with personal issues. We're looking at the public record. We're looking at the judicial philosophy. There are some issues during the course of those 8 or 9 years, particularly back in 1983, when Clarence Thomas was willing to take on William Bradford Reynolds on the Williams case. It was a New Orleans Equal Employment Opportunity Commission case. Unfortunately, shortly after he took that position of independence, I think Edward Meese and William Bradford Reynolds met with him and basically explained what the Reagan administration position was going to be on civil rights issues. Again, I think the record has to speak for itself. That's on the basis which we have to make a decision. Yes, all the way, John?
Of the 185 organizations in the coalition, how many are clearly now against Thomas?
I would not be able to address that at this time. I said the executive committee of the leadership conference met this week. The executive committee has 25 national organizations on it. And as I said before, there was a very strong consensus on behalf of the leadership conference position. All were in accord with the final resolution on the consensus position, again, with a couple of organizations wanting it made very clear that they were not taking a position.
Of the 25, how many were fully in accord?
Again, a very strong majority is necessary for a consensus within the leadership conference. I don't have exactly how many people said we are not going to take a position. All I know is at the end of the meeting, there was a very strong consensus that the leadership conference should proceed.
The vote round?
No, no.
There's consensus.
We go around the table and everybody shares with the rest of the executive committee after a period of time of discussion what the recommendations are. Again, we don't vote really. It's done by consensus. And believe me, when you have that many groups and they let themselves be known, you quickly find out how strong the consensus is, and it's a very strong consensus. Yes?
Supreme Court nominations, are there any recommendations that you have for possible nominees?
I hearken back to last week when Bill Gibson and Ben Hooks of the NAACP immediately said, boy, we could come up with a good list very quickly and submit it to the president. Obviously, we would have liked and still would like at some time to meet with the president or his advisors, or to submit a list of qualified nominees or prospective nominees. Let's face it, there are a lot of well-qualified black Republicans or Hispanic Republicans or women Republicans who have the public record in the judicial philosophy, the demonstrated commitment to equal opportunity. I mentioned Edward W. Brooke. I certainly would put him up there as a lawyer who was a senator and a former state attorney general. William Coleman of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, or Bill Brown, who was chairman under Nixon of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. The list goes on and on and on. I guess that's why so many people were incredulous that the president said that Clarence Thomas was the best qualified in this country. Not only is he not the best qualified person for this job in the country, but there are many black Republicans and other Republicans who are minorities or women who are much more qualified to be a Supreme Court justice. Yes?
Going back to the point of what you're going to do now, Clarence Thomas has met with 57 senators. Congress is out of town. His confirmation comes up the first day Congress is back. Are you going to be spending this month contacting senators all over the country? What exactly are you going to do to get these senators to change their mind when they're on vacation?
Sure. Without contradicting my response to Arch Parsons of the Baltimore Sun, obviously we will be engaged in an effort to share the information, the facts about Clarence Thomas's public record and his judicial philosophy with the Senate, with the public, and with our own constituencies. We are at this moment, and a number of organizations in and outside of the Leadership Conference over the last few weeks have been asking senators not to make any decisions until they have an opportunity to weigh all the evidence. That's in large measure what we'll be asking senators, both Democrats and Republicans, over the next several weeks before the hearings begin. They should remain open-minded until they have an opportunity to hear Clarence Thomas, and also have an opportunity to hear those who are opposing Clarence Thomas, and of course the give and take of the Senate Judiciary Committee hearings. The Senate Judiciary Committee hearings are always critical in any nomination. I think that's when the decisions are made by the senators. There's no question that the White House has tried a preemptive strike over the last 4 or 5 weeks to try to get a majority of senators who are committed before the hearings even begin. My guess is there are at least 65 senators who are truly uncommitted right now and who want to hear all the facts before they make a decision. In the rear?
Rob, is there a time between the Civil Rights Act of 1991 and the Thomas nomination, and do you see Senator Danforth's inability to reach a compromise with the White House as helpful or harmful to your efforts and the efforts of others who opposed Judge Thomas to defeat his nomination?
Well, the confluence of events certainly complicates matters. I believe that everyone in the Leadership Conference considers the Thomas nomination and the Civil Rights Act of 1991 as two separate and distinct issues, and each issue must be judged on its own merits. I'm quite confident that Senator Danforth and other senators would have the same attitude with respect to judging each issue on its own merits. Of course, Senator Danforth has his own interesting dilemma with the White House rejecting what he's trying to do on the Civil Rights Act while he is supporting the Thomas nomination. My guess is Senator Danforth, when working with the White House, will treat these issues separately and distinctly and judge each on its merits, and that's what we'll do.
Follow-up, would you see any inconsistency in, you got 66 votes last fall to override the veto. Of course, you only need 51 to defeat Judge Thomas. Would you see it as inconsistent for a senator to vote for the Civil Rights Act of 1991 and to also vote for Judge Thomas's nomination?
Well, we certainly hope that the 66 senators who voted for the Civil Rights Act and to override the veto would oppose the Thomas nomination. Certainly, there is so much at stake with respect to both issues. and there's no question that you know our principal targets, which would be those 66 senators plus some others. So hopefully a majority of the senators will vote for the Civil Rights Act, which I believe will become law sometime later this year. Most likely it's going to have to be with 2/3 majorities, since it becomes increasingly obvious that the President doesn't want a civil rights bill enacted into law, that he's playing this for partisan politics, and that's all. But I'm also confident that we can get a majority on the Clarence Thomas Supreme Court nomination. Steve Holmes?
Ralph, you've made much of Clarence Thomas's record at EEOC, the 13,000 unenforced age discrimination cases, the backlog, the decrease in settlements, the increase in time. Should a person be denied a seat on the Supreme Court possibly because he was a poor administrator of a federal agency?
There's no question, and we did not address this issue directly, that his record, his entire record at EEOC in education should be something that addresses the issues with respect to qualification for Supreme Court nomination. However, I think that we were crystal clear in our reasoning behind our opposition when we addressed the record at EEOC and at the Department of Education. It was that Clarence Thomas, on a number of occasions, decided to inject his personal philosophy instead of strictly enforcing the laws passed by Congress and interpreted by the Supreme Court. That certainly applies to the age discrimination cases, to the pension issue with respect to retired older Americans over 65. It certainly applies.
Earlier that he failed to prosecute those age discrimination cases out of neglect, not out of because he willfully defied the law. That sounds like an administrative problem as opposed to a philosophical problem.
Well, I think when he testified, and he testified several times on this, that in the beginning, I think he started out saying that there were 75 cases that had not been addressed or had lapsed. But it happened over such a long period of time, I think it's safe to say that once he was on notice, over 6 months, a year, 18 months, or whatever it was, that it becomes more than just an omission. It becomes a decision not to enforce the law, and that's the type of thing that we're talking about. I think it's very parallel to what happened at the Department of Education when there were hundreds of cases under the Adams-Wheel decision, and there were compliance times that had to be met, and Judge Pratt basically said, without equivocation, that Judge Clarence Thomas at that time, was not acting consistently with the law. Maybe even more importantly than Judge Pratt's finding was that Clarence Thomas admitted it unequivocally on the record in a deposition.
Ralph, several of you used the word hostile in describing the judge's attitude towards civil rights. That's a strong word. Can you all back that up?
Well, I couldn't read the entire leadership conference report, and I'm sure you all wouldn't have let me. And there are other people who have released reports. I think hostile is the correct word to use, both with respect to what we've been talking about on the public record, but also his harsh condemnation of many of the landmark Supreme Court decisions on civil rights. Clarence Thomas does use harsh language when he's addressing many of the bipartisan civil rights policies of the last 30 years and many of the Supreme Court decisions that have come down. So I think all of us feel comfortable with that word. Why don't we have one or two more? Yes, Ruth?
People are going to senators and asking them to keep an open mind and not to commit themselves one way or another.
Ruth, we wouldn't mind if one or two or three or more decided that they would announce their opposition. But what we're saying is wait till all the evidence is in.
Well,
Yeah.
if you're urging them to wait till all the evidence is in, can you just discuss why it's appropriate for the leadership conference not to do so?
We, of course, are advocates who have spent a lot of time going over the public record of Clarence Thomas, a process, I might add, that commenced before July 1st of 1991. Many of us in the leadership conference came very close to opposing Clarence Thomas at the Circuit Court of Appeals level. It was a very close decision. And basically, many of the organizations signaled to the public, to the press, to the Senate, that it would be a very different story if there was a Clarence Thomas nomination to the Supreme Court. because on the circuit court you follow precedent, on the Supreme Court you get the set precedent. There's no higher court of appeal. So I believe it is safe to say that those within the Leadership Conference and outside of the Leadership Conference who have taken positions have taken them on the basis of an exhaustive review of the public record of Clarence Thomas, exhaustive review of all of his speeches and articles with respect to his opinions on judicial philosophy. Many of those who have taken positions have had personal dealings with Clarence Thomas going back 5, 10, or more years, and I think feel very comfortable with their advocacy of this position. So I think it really is a question of responsibility, that having this knowledge and having a certain amount of time before the hearings start and the process begins in the Senate Judiciary Committee, we are under an obligation to make sure that we share these facts, that we share this record with the press, with the public, and with the Senate as soon as possible. Thank you very much, everybody.
That concludes this news conference held today by the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights as the group announced their position on the nomination of Judge Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court. Just a reminder that this program will re-air again tomorrow morning here on C-SPAN, just past 7 a.m. Eastern Time. Coming up next, we bring you a pair of speeches from a Washington Center forum. You'll hear first on the effect of the Gulf War on U.S. foreign policy by former charge d'affaires of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, Bruce Langan.
This week on Book Notes.
We never really started out intending to write a book about Watergate. Our original premise, our original project was a look at Bob Woodward, the journalist, post-Watergate, when he was Metropolitan Editor of the Washington Post during the famous Janet Cook affair. And it was only once we learned about Woodward's military background, which Lynn talked about his relationship with Haig, that the whole ball of string began to unravel, and we found this incredible story about what was really happening during the Watergate period.
We're not fools. We understood that this book was not going to be accepted overnight. We understood that. We understood what we call the 5-year test. We believe Silent Coup will be there. It's not the definitive work on Watergate, but it turns it in the right direction. We begin to get the players in their right place, and others will follow us, and I'm sure they will be able to expand.
Silent Coup, the removal of a president, is the topic of this week's Book Notes. Our guests are authors Len Kolodny and Robert Getland. In their book, the two discuss the Nixon White House in the Watergate years and claim to have new inside information on the events that led to the president's resignation in August 1974. Sunday beginning at 8 and 11 p.m. Eastern Time.
Coming up next, we bring you a Washington Center forum looking at the effects of the Gulf War on U.S. foreign policy and the future role of U.S. strategic intelligence. Those were the topics at today's Washington Center meeting. You will hear the comments first by Bruce Langan, former charge d'affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran at the time of the Iranian takeover of the U.S. Embassy in 1979. He was one of 52 Westerners held hostage for 444 days. Later, you'll be hearing from former CIA Director William Colby. He headed up Central Intelligence during the early 1970s before retiring 16 years ago. He now serves as a defense and security consultant to several corporations. The Washington Center sponsors seminars for college students from around the country who come to the nation's capital to learn about the governmental process and to receive briefings about current issues.
Welcome to the Washington Center Summer Seminar on the Global Village Beyond the Cold War. The Washington Center is a nonprofit educational organization which has operated for over 16 years in the nation's capital. Over 16,000 students have participated in its internship programs or academic seminars, such as this one, and next week's dealing with the global marketplace. The students represent over 100 colleges and universities and several foreign countries. It is my pleasure today to introduce our speaker who will look at the Persian Gulf and the lessons of the Persian Gulf, Ambassador L. Bruce Langan. Ambassador Langan is a Minnesotan and holds an MA from the University of Minnesota and has served 3 years with the U.S. Navy, 1943 to 1946. Early in his Foreign Service career, he served in Germany and in Iran. He has also served as the deputy and then officer in charge of the Greek Cypriot affairs in the Department of State. In 1960, Ambassador Langan was assigned to Karachi as political officer, and from 1964 to 1967, he served as officer in charge of Pakistan-Afghanistan affairs in the department. After a year at the National War College, he was appointed Deputy Chief of Mission in Kabul, Afghanistan. After his return to the department in 1971, he served successively as the Country Director for Nepal, Sri Lanka, and the Maldive Islands, and as Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near East and South Asian Affairs. He was then appointed Deputy Assistant Secretary for European Affairs. He served as ambassador to Malta from 1977 to 1979. From June until November 4th, 1979, Ambassador Langan served as chargé d'affaires of the embassy in Tehran. He was among those held hostage in Tehran from that date until January 20th, 1981. From August 1981 until September 1986, he served as Vice President of the National Defense University at Fort McNair, Washington, D.C. He retired from the Foreign Service in 1987 and most recently has been Executive Director of the National Commission on the Public Service, a nonprofit organization dedicated to strengthening the public appreciation for public service at all levels of government. We're very pleased that he's with us today, and we'd like to welcome him to the Washington Center. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Gail. You now know more about Bruce Langan than you ever wanted to know, probably. Except you don't know that I also have 3 Navy sons and 2 Navy daughters-in-law. Go Navy, beat Army. I don't see any Army in the audience. Good morning. And good morning to all of your compatriots who have been in Washington or who are in Washington under the auspices of the Washington Center, reached via C-SPAN, I gather, this morning. And that's a very good thing for them and for me, and particularly for the Washington Center. I want to add could I borrow a watch? I see it, there's a watch up there. I want to add my welcome to those that you've heard ad nauseum probably already. Well, you've been in Washington, to this city. A place once so aptly described by George Will, the columnist, as a place surrounded on all sides by reality. And that may be an affront to some of that reality out there. It certainly isn't an affront to Washington, D.C. I think it is a good reminder, however, that expression, that there's a lot of reality beyond the Beltway. And that's a good reminder, particularly to those of us who serve and live in this town of Washington, D.C. I've been here for now 42 years and running, and I love it. I was caught up in Potomac fever rather quickly after I came here. 42 years in and out of this place. And I suspect that many of you caught it too during the time that you've been here, or will catch it. And I would say to all of you and your colleagues, don't waste a minute of the time you've got in this town. Don't waste a minute of enjoying it, learning from it, being here in this place that in many ways, in many respects, is where the action is. You, I gather, are from all over the place. I know there's at least one of you from Washington, D.C., sitting down there in the front row, as I am. under the auspices of this program, the Washington Center, which I have known and with whom I've worked now for some time, an organization dedicated in the way it brings you to town to the best example of public service in our country. You do come from all over. I ask almost every audience to whom I speak, whether any of you come from Minnesota, from that far out in the boondocks. Nobody here this morning. Minnesota. These other folks don't know what the heartland is. God's world out there. We share it with the mosquitoes. It's our state bird. But those who malign Minnesota, we remind them that we have a real purpose in being. Anyone here from Iowa? We're there to protect Canada from Iowa. Nobody from North Dakota? That's really far out. Not the end of the world, they say, but you can see it from there. Sorry about that, North Dakota. You may be listening. Any Wisconsin? I'm looking for the heartland, which is what it is. Is anybody here from west of the Alleghenies? Are you all East Coast? Is that correct, Gail? From where? California. That's way out. That's really way out. In the boondocks. Huh? That's as far as, well, there's Hawaii, and there is Alaska, and a little water in between. Well, I check also to find out where you're working, and not least if there's anyone here from the Department of State. I ask that because as a diplomat I want to be sure who the truth squad is out there if they're listening to me, following up on what I might have to say this morning. But I'm correct, am I not, Gail, that these folks work in a variety of agencies, nonprofits, business in Washington?
No, these are students here for this year.
For the whole year?
For this week.
Just for the week? Well, forgive me. So you haven't been here long? Yes, ma'am. Washington, D.C. Super. God knows we need that these days, huh? But you're from a variety of places, including California, and I'm delighted to see you, and I'm glad you're here. You've probably heard too often this morning, or during the time you've been here, even in the short time that you've been here, suggestions from a variety of places and people that you should consider careers in public service. You are, what, seniors, juniors in college, more or less? I saw an interesting T-shirt just yesterday, by the way. You know, we're a remarkable country, the way we philosophize on our T-shirts and our bumper stickers and our license plates more than any other country on earth, perhaps. This was a T-shirt for West Virginia University, VA, and went on to say in this T-shirt, the best place to spend 5 or 6 years of your life. I said to my colleague, I thought it was 4 years that normally spent. And he said to me, you've been out of college too long. You've been reminded about careers in public service if you haven't made a career choice. And you may be encouraged while you're here in this city, a place of considerable public service careers, to consider that kind of an option if you haven't done so already. But I will repeat my own view after now some 45 years in public service in various dimensions, currently as president of the American Academy of Diplomacy, that it's a damn satisfying way to spend your life. I've just spent, as Gail indicated in introducing me, 3 years as executive director of something called the National Commission on the Public Service, led by Paul Volcker, formerly of the Federal Reserve System, a group of prominent Americans, 36 of them, who got together to study and make recommendations on the way in which the career service of the federal government in particular could be strengthened to serve the public out there. And as Paul Volcker has often put it, public service can assure you more hours of satisfaction in relation to X number of hours of frustration than almost any other career choice that he could recommend. And he says that after some 26 to 30 years of public service. And of course, as a diplomat, I would particularly commend the Foreign Service to you. Any of you here in the audience considering that kind of an option? There's my Washington, D.C. friend again, who is considering, and you too. If you haven't made that choice, or if you've got some frustrations or uncertainty as to what you're going to consider as a career choice, may I remind you about the Peace Corps of the United States. Some of you may have run into some of them. Spend a couple of years learning a little bit more about yourself, because assuredly you do that in the United States Peace Corps. And for that matter, there is the Navy and the military services, on which you will understand why I'm somewhat prejudiced. I would go on to say, however, no one should suggest in any way, and we need some of the best and the brightest of you young people in public service in this town, in state governments, and local governments across the country, and some of you may be considering that. We can't ask for all of the best and the brightest of our young people to consider public service in government. This is, after all, a private sector-oriented country, and we'd need some of the best and the brightest of you there, too. But I would conclude that portion of my added remarks by suggesting to you that whatever your career choice, Wall Street, lawyers, public servants, whatever, carve out a little time. Make a commitment now that in your lives you will devote some time, X amount of time, true to George Bush's 1,000 points of light credo, to the idea of public service in some fashion in your communities across the country. But I'm supposed to talk here about foreign policy, and specifically about the impact of the Gulf War on foreign policy for this country of ours. And I want to make it clear at the outset that I'm an optimist. By nature, I'm an optimist. You can't live as a farmer in Minnesota without being an optimist. I spoke to my brother out there last night on the telephone. He's a farmer out there, and he lives in one of the 2 counties in southern Minnesota that's been declared a disaster area because of the vagaries of weather this year. It requires a lot of faith and a lot of optimism to live out there, as it does in foreign policy, for that matter. I'm not a naive optimist. I'd like to think I'm not, because that kind of an optimist quickly becomes a pessimist, and you know the old definition of a pessimist, that's an optimist with experience. I concluded, however, long since, that to begin one's life, or to begin a career with an excess amount of pessimism, is a hell of a way to start. It's a lot more fun on the trip, in my view, if you start as an optimist. And for a diplomat, one is reminded of an expression from Adlai Stevenson, who once said that optimism is to a diplomat what courage is to a soldier. And surely we have needed that at times in the Middle East. So my optimism, call it naivete if you will, as I was accused of being recently on the Donahue show when I was talking about the October surprise business, we want to talk about that later. That optimism, my naivete if you will, may come through, and I ask you to forgive me for that in my observations. In the general observations that I want to make before I get to your questions, where I think you want to reserve the bulk of your time, you and I and our countrymen across the country surely have lived with a very interesting time over the last several years in the current history of the world, if you will, and the current history of the experience of our country out there on the world scene, reminding me often of an expression from Arnold Toynbee. The historian is supposed to have said once that history is one damn thing after another. Beginning this exciting period that I refer to with the collapse, the end of that ugly symbol of despotism, if you will, the Berlin Wall. And then the revolution of 1989, running across Eastern Europe, extending most recently to Albania and other places around the world, all of which marked the end of the Cold War, the winning, if you will, of the Cold War. That dramatic series of events in the revolution of 1989, out there on the stage of world history, that saw that kind of dramatic demonstration for all the world to see, that the communist system had been a denial of humankind's quest for freedom. And then all of that followed by the drama, the excitement, the difficulties, the tragedies too, of the Gulf War and of its display of the fact that in military terms at least, there is but one superpower left on the world stage. And of course a success in that war, greatly facilitated by the very fact of the revolution of 1989 and the end of the confrontation during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. I'm not the first to remind you, I'm sure, that that Gulf War would have been a very different war, could have been a very different war, if our old relationship with the Soviet Union and its support then of the government of Iraq had been what it was. We did it well, that war, and as a diplomat, I salute. I take every opportunity I have, not least because I had two sons out there in the United States Navy, saluting what I call the uniformed public servants of the United States, the members of the armed services, the men and women, for their skill, their professionalism, their discipline, and their service out there on the front lines. We've won a war, but we have not won the peace. And winning the peace, I need hardly remind you, is not an easy aftermath of war. It is not the first time that we've reminded that it's a lot harder to win the peace sometimes than it is to win the war. Indeed, instead of a new world order out there in the Middle East, we've been reminded in recent months how much of that old world order, or at least that old order in the Middle East, remains in place. Well, what can someone say about the impact, the effects on foreign policy, on the ambiance, the atmosphere in which we conduct our foreign policy has flowed from that success in the Gulf War? Well, let me make it clear at the outset that in terms of our overall policy objectives, nothing really has changed. Our objectives, in a large sense, in that part of the world, the preservation of our relationship with the State of Israel, the assurance of a free flow of oil, the friendship in that latter context with the Arab states of that region, all of those objectives remain as much in the fore as they were before. So it is the process that we're talking about and the prospects of achieving those objectives that we're talking about. And in that context, let me put my views about the impact in terms of 10 dimensions before I get to your questions. First, and at least for the short term, there is a greatly increased sense of public confidence among the American people in how they see themselves on the world stage. We feel better about ourselves and about our capacity to exercise leadership on the world stage. And that is no small plus for the atmosphere in which this country's, any country's leadership approaches the conduct of foreign policy. A second dimension, the Gulf War confirmed in military terms what was already obvious in political terms in the aftermath of the revolution of 1989, about at least the potential for American leadership on the world stage, something that has now seen George Bush go off to his first summit in Moscow and lecture the Soviets from a stage in the Kremlin itself about their errant ways, if you will, in some dimension still in foreign policy in Cuba from our point of view. The Soviets in the northern islands demanded by the government of Japan to be returned to them in the aftermath still of World War II, lecturing them as well on the degree still of their military spending and their budget at cost to all of the economic requirements that now plague the Soviet Union so massively. A third dimension, the Gulf War surely dramatized the reliability, the utility of military power in the pursuit of foreign policy objectives. Military power as an instrument of diplomacy, if you will. Reminding me of an expression once by George Kennan, a venerable retired diplomat now up at Princeton, who immediately after World War II, you may remember, was the architect, if you will, of the containment policy, beginning with the Mr. X article in Foreign Affairs. In those immediate years after World War II, serving as the first deputy commandant for foreign affairs at the National War College here in Washington as a part of the National Defense University today. The archives of that institution record that George Kennan in 1946 said to a group of military officers in a class there, "You have no idea," and this is speaking as a diplomat, as he was, "you have no idea how much it contributes to the general politeness and pleasantness of diplomacy when you've got a little quiet armed force in the background." That was good counsel then, and it surely is today. There is no doubt that our resounding military success in the Gulf War, in the short term at least, has enormously enhanced American credibility abroad, and especially in the Middle East, where, for example, in the foreseeable future, the United States will be a major participant in military terms in the security arrangements for that region, and particularly the Persian Gulf. Our credibility abroad, and especially the Middle East, greatly enhanced by that successful use of force, and force commands respect there as it does almost anywhere else. That we have the power, that we had the power then, and we had the will to use it. And that enhanced credibility as a world leader is a very useful ingredient in the pursuit of foreign policy generally. A fourth dimension, and that is that with respect to the Middle East, the Gulf War, the pledges we made in the course of that war as to what we would do in its aftermath, and this credibility that we have won in its successful outcome, have now left us, the United States, with a heavy obligation, a heavy commitment in policy terms, a self-imposed commitment, if you will, to use that credibility in the pursuit of peace, resumption of the peace process, in particular between the Arabs and the Israelis and the Palestinians. A fifth dimension, the war and our victory in it gave us specific credibility. I spoke before about general credibility worldwide, but we earned specific credibility with all of the parties to the Arab-Israeli and the Palestinian issue. Grudging, perhaps, from some quarters, even the Iranians and the Gaddafi in Libya, but apparently real credibility where it counts most, and that is with Syria. the current success on the part of Secretary Baker, and I use the term success, albeit that it is still early in the game, in building the basis for a peace conference, is an American show, and the Soviets are on the sidelines. And the parties know it, not least Assad in Damascus. A sixth dimension. The war clearly gave the United Nations a new status, a more positive status and stature among the American public, where in many ways it had been derided for too many years as weak and ineffective, and we shouldn't be bothered with it. The American public now has a new and more positive appreciation of the possibilities, the potential for the United Nations as an instrument, if you will, in support of American policy. And for that matter, the United Nations itself now finds itself engaged in ways out there on the world scene, and particularly in the Middle East, that it has never before seen or been involved in. And these two elements of the United Nations equation could have significant, if still unclear, implications for how we use or exploit, if you will, the United Nations in future foreign policy issues there and elsewhere on the world stage. A seventh dimension, the Gulf War and its outcome have left us as a major player in OPEC's leadership, in OPEC's deliberation, the oil cartel. A player, albeit outside the immediate councils of OPEC. But in terms of oil pricing, in the deliberations of that body, the view of the United States probably has never been stronger, and that will loom, thus, the OPEC oil pricing arrangements, for example, will, at least for the immediate future, loom less as a problem in terms of foreign policy than it was before, because of the current oil glut, and because of our current relationships, and particularly with the Saudis and the Kuwaitis, because of the absence of Iraqi oil and in the oil availabilities on the world scene. All of that leaves our relationship with OPEC stronger, and OPEC's role less a matter of concern for the United States in foreign policy considerations. An eighth dimension in the aftermath of the Gulf War for foreign policy. That war, and especially its aftermath, I think, have reminded us that respect or for support for, or that with respect to one of America's major generally defined foreign policy objectives on the world scene, that is the promotion, to the extent that we can do it, of democratic institutions elsewhere and of democratic processes of government. That objective is not one, I think we have been reminded, that is easy of achievement in a place like the Middle East. We have not suddenly seen major change in democratic processes of government in places like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, much less Iraq. A ninth consideration. I trust that the war and its aftermath, and its victory in that aftermath, have also reminded all of us, including foreign policy practitioners in this town, in the area of foreign policy, reminded us of reality, of cold, hard reality. We have not reached a nirvana, if you will. We are not the world's policemen, capable of changing the dimensions of foreign policy all of that easily, despite the dramatic success in the Gulf War, despite the dramatic successes of the Revolution of 1989 in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. Much, indeed most of the agenda that confronts us and the rest of the world out there on the world in foreign policy issues remain as complex and as difficult as before. Or to put it differently, there is no easy new world order out there, despite the possibilities that exist that are different and new. None of the substance, the content of problems like the Arab-Israeli issue have changed fundamentally. Nothing has changed fundamentally in the Cyprus issue, or in China, or like in GATT and the Uruguay round and dealing with international trading problems. Or for that matter, nothing has changed, in some ways more difficult, in what might be called the new revolution in the Soviet Union and the problems that that country is having in putting its house into some kind of new order. Some are worse, fundamentally, at least worse in terms of their appearance before us in such dramatic ways, such as in Yugoslavia and the tragedy involving the Croats and the Serbs in particular. I guess what I'm saying for you foreign policy, foreign service aspirants in particular, there's a lot left out there on the agenda for you and for the rest of us here in town to deal with. And then 10th, my final listing of this agenda, or this listing of things that have impacted on how we pursue foreign policy abroad. And that is that I think all of us should hope that the Gulf War has reminded us that strong and effective leadership and articulation of national purposes, of new ideas and sacrifices affecting the domestic agenda are needed as well. Or to put it differently, surely all of us have hoped that we could demonstrate, that we can demonstrate in some way the same kind of spirit, national cohesiveness, purpose, skill in addressing our domestic agenda as our military forces did so well in that display of a culture of competence out there in winning the war. Our strength, our credibility, our capacity, our potential in foreign policy depends heavily on our capacity in both the near and the long term to show by example that here at home we can lead as well. In every respect, in my view, the real strength of a country, of a people, of a government in power in this city, of an administration in power in this city, its real strength in foreign policy terms depends on its capacity to demonstrate to the rest of the world the very best of American purpose and success and example in dealing with our problems at home. And God knows we are not doing as well as we should. We are not doing as well as the quality of our people available to be put to the task should make it possible. Not doing as well as we should to leave something for you as young people other than perhaps the creation of a new beatitude, blessed are the young, for they shall inherit the national debt. With that, let me take your questions for about 25 minutes, whatever you've got left. I don't need applause at this point. Yes, sir. Would you tell me where you're from?
Yes, my name is Tom Higdon, and I'm from Eckerd College in St. Petersburg, Florida. I was just curious as to your opinion. Looking back over the past 10 years in the Persian Gulf region, And now things have come up where you could almost say that we helped or nurtured Saddam Hussein and a lot of the other enemies of Iran. Seeing what we had to deal with in the end, would there have been a cheaper course of action as far as lives, money, and military strength than waiting until he finally did something like this?
I think the answer to that would have to be yes, of course. If we had lived, if we had done something differently originally, we learn from every experience. And that's part of the process of foreign policy too. We learn that we make mistakes, and we did make mistakes in our relationships with Saddam Hussein, tilting as we thought it necessary for broader strategic purposes in the Persian Gulf region in support of Iraq during some of those years of the Iran-Iraq War. And looking back on it with the benefit of hindsight today, yeah, that was unfortunate in some of its dimensions.
As a follow-up to that, then, it's been the policy of the United States, or at least it seems, to support dictators to strengthen these regional policies, you know, to prevent communism, or in this case, to combat Iran. Would you say that in the future that would still be an option for Americans' foreign policy?
I don't think it's been a given policy that we should always support X number of dictators in support of X number of foreign policy objectives. There are some instances that you can cite and that you have with respect to Iran, with respect to Iraq, with respect to some of our relationships with the Philippines where we have done that, and to our regret in the long term. I can only say that, you know, that there's a real world out there. And foreign policy implementers in particular, in our embassies abroad, for example, deal with a government in place. And they deal with the government in place in terms of the policy directives that they're given from Washington. One doesn't simply sort of set aside reality in any place in pursuing our interests abroad. Sometimes cold, hard, perceived at that moment, American national interests prevail, as we thought they did in the Iran-Iraq War, for example, when we were concerned, as we were, and to some extent rightly, with the potential for the export of Islamic fundamentalism throughout the Middle East and the instability that might result from that, affecting governments with which we were dealing and had to deal in pursuing our objectives in that part of the world. I guess I'm saying that we should learn, and I'd like to think we do learn, and we learned eventually in the Philippines, in time, to come to the support of Cory Aquino in that instance. In Iran, we came to that appreciation of our mistakes too late. In terms of our relationship with the Shah, we should have begun to change earlier. I cannot assure you that this government will forever and a day be clear, free of any kind of record of dealing with what you call dictators out there, authoritarian regimes. We cannot change the world quite that easily, but we can learn in the process, and I hope we've learned from this one. Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Craig McKinley from Ramapo College of New Jersey. I realize this lecture is supposed to be on Iraq, but I was wondering if you wouldn't mind fielding a question about Sri Lanka based on your knowledge and my personal interest. How do you feel the government or non-government there, due to the political upheaval and the different religions that are inhabited there, how do you feel that will come out, and do you feel there's any resolution?
I'll have to cop out, if you will, on that question. I have not served in Sri Lanka. I cannot speak for Sri Lanka in terms of policy objectives. The situation there today, I really don't know it. My dealings with Sri Lanka are now roughly 20 years past, when I did not serve there but dealt with it in the Department of State briefly. So I'll have to say I can't answer that question. Yes.
University of the Pacific in Stockton, California. What do you think will be the outcome of the peace talks coming up?
What do I think of the outcome of the peace talks coming up? I don't know. I will go as far as to say that the peace conference will happen. We were very dubious about that, skeptical about it. Some people are still skeptical that it will happen at all. that Mr. Baker really has in hand enough commitments yet to permit them to come to some kind of a conference somewhere. We don't even know where it's going to be yet. But I think it's going to happen. I think we have the clout, we have the credibility with the parties, as I suggested in my remarks, to almost require them to appear on the scene. We have a commitment from Assad to deal in this way, which is almost unprecedented. It is unprecedented, which is a powerful instrument. We have the Palestinians who are still not fully committed, but I find it difficult to see that they have any alternative but to find some way, even given the strictures that the Israeli government has posed in that respect, to attend. As for his outcome, well, I don't think any of us should go very far out on any branches. I think it will take place. I think in terms of a general opening conference, I think the possibility of follow-on direct talks, as the Israelis insist must then result, is there. But by no means are they guaranteed at this point. It could stumble, as in previous Middle Eastern conference did in Geneva a decade or so ago, or more ago. I guess I would use the old Middle East expression in saying, inshallah. That means God willing. As the Middle Easterners are wont to say, that it will happen and there will be some progress in a halting, difficult fashion. I don't see a repeat of the Camp David process dealing with only two countries, that is the Egyptians and the Israelis, where the president in effect hauled them off to Camp David and engineered a solution, a peace treaty eventually. It's going to be much more difficult than that, much slower, however slow that was. There is a window of opportunity, an overused expression. There are new circumstances in the Middle East as a consequence of this war affecting the Arab-Israeli issue. There is, I think, a new attitude among Palestinians that they've really got to find some way to sit down with the Israelis. There is the hardline position on territory that the government of Shamir has taken, which certainly in terms of the point that we are at today is a major problem. I cannot see myself that there can be any settlement without it being based on the old concept of land for peace. I guess if I had to make some kind of guess today of what might be possible, it would still be some kind of, at best for the near-term future, a confederated Palestinian arrangement with the government of Jordan on some amount of land on the West Bank. The Golan Heights with Syria, yes, I think that's possible, that something could be arranged there, despite the tough talk being heard from Shamir about no give ever on that point. If some arrangements could be made on military security affecting that small piece of territory, and I think that's feasible, then I think there is a deal possible there. I've been going out on some branches myself and saying some of these things. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Angelina Kennedy from St. Joseph's University. Referring to
and from Washington, D.C.
And from Washington, D.C. Referring to your number one about how our confidence has increased to engage in activities on the world stage, with regards to the coming together of one European community and NATO, do you think that we should overtly exert our leadership in that instance, or should we take a step back and let them work on it themselves instead of letting it be what we want for them instead of what they want for them.
When you say they, you mean the European community?
I do.
And some of their problems in terms of dealing with Yugoslavia, perhaps?
And the coming together.
And
as
they're coming
one.
together?
Yes.
Well, I guess I would say in a general way it is for them to work that out, as they have done to date. We are not a participant in the European community. We don't expect to be. It is an entity that Europe, the countries of Europe have put together, has been evolving since the Treaty of Rome in, 1960, encouraged all along by American policy, by government statements in this country, concern expressed, yes, along the way, often, by the United States over the possibility that it will result in a kind of closed place, complicating the potential for free trade on the world scene. And that's still a problem, not least in the most recent example of the Uruguay round in trying to reduce tariffs, with the European position in particular on agricultural subsidies. There are these problems. We cannot dictate to the Europeans how they work them out. We can pressure them with our point of view. We can counsel, as we are doing. We are a participant, if you will, in other dimensions of European unity. That is the CSCE framework, where we and Canada and all of the countries of Europe are participants. We are a participant also with Europe, and thus indirectly in the evolution of a united Europe looking toward 92 in NATO. And that is an area also that has yet to be worked out in terms of future military relationships for the United States with NATO and with the European Union. All of these things have been evolving over the last couple of decades, since World War II, in remarkable ways. I have always been myself, and I think in general our country has too, been a strong advocate and supporter of the growth of a European Union, whatever the problems that might result in terms of trade, whatever the complications that might develop potentially also with respect to certain security. I'm all for it, and I'm encouraged by what's happened. Any other questions? There aren't many this morning. Yes, ma'am.
Christina Riley from Villanova University. You just mentioned the CSCE, and I was just curious because you don't hear much about it, and I was just curious on your feelings with regards to that being a possible vehicle for worldwide security.
Well, I don't see it as a vehicle for worldwide security. Was not put, CSC, the Council on Security and Cooperation in Europe, was not put together originally as a security instrument or an organization that had any kind of military clout. It was an outgrowth, a product of the evolving Western-Eastern Cold War confrontation. It resolved some of the problems affecting Eastern Europe at the time, or at least made them easier to live with, to deal with. It has evolved today into a consultative, if you will, a new consultative political organization that is unique and I think has a great deal of potential because it includes all of Western Europe and includes Canada and the United States. It's an organization that is a fledgling, if you will. It hasn't really got its feet on the ground yet. In the aftermath of the revolution of 1989 in Eastern Europe, it has new potential. But we have seen in the Yugoslav situation today that it is not that yet that can play much of a role. Potentially it may. It is more the Western European community dealing with it or trying to deal with it or trying to be helpful in resolving the problems of Yugoslavia. Yes, sir.
Tom Higdon again from Eckerd College. With Eastern Europe now coming into free market and democracies, or working towards that end, and the end of the Cold War, and now this new Persian Gulf incident, how do you perceive security in the future? I mean, obviously, at this point, you see it as military. A lot of people are talking that security in the next century is going to be in terms of economic clout. Do you think that military is still going to play that significant of a role, or will it be replaced by economic means?
I have left you with the wrong impression. I have obviously left you with the impression that our future, our security, rests fundamentally and heavily on armed force, on our military capacity to be a kind of policeman on the world stage. And I did not mean to leave you with that impression. That would be wrong. That is not my view. I was asked to speak on the immediate implications, impact in foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East, of the Gulf War and our military success there. And in the short term, there is no question but that military success, that demonstration of American power in military terms, is a powerful factor, an instrument, if you will, in furthering American interests overseas. But I agree with you wholeheartedly, and I had hoped that my last point about the power of example, and I did not address it specifically in economic terms, would have reminded you that I think our real strength is what we can do at home in setting an example, what we can do in demonstrating in that example a strong economy that benefits the rank and file of our people, that shows that we are true to the example that we set in the revolution of 1989. It was our example in that revolution, in a sense, in a considerable sense, that saw the success of that revolution. Rightly or wrongly, the peoples of Eastern Europe identified us as the kind of example that they would like to follow in terms of democratic processes and a free market. Not that we are the success that they think we are. And God knows we have shortcomings. God knows our economy is in a serious strait at the present time. I agree with you, I think, in what you were saying, that our real strength for the long term is in the economic area, particularly given the fact that there are two new major players in economic terms, or there will be, and there are today for that matter, on the world scene, and that is the European Community now, and particularly beginning in 1992, and Japan. And the other, what are they called? The tigers of the Far East and Southeast Asia. Those countries out there, Korea, South Korea, Taiwan, and the others, Indonesia. The potential that they've got and are demonstrating in putting the emphasis that they have on a free market and an economic growth. We can learn from them in that respect. We have borne a heavy burden in terms of military expenditures and the weight of those military expenditures on our budget and on our economy over the decades of the Cold War. I'd like to believe that the expenditure has been, despite the ups and downs, has been worth it in terms of the way in which that contributed to our success in confronting the Soviet Union and dealing with that threat. But I go back to what I said at the beginning. The power of our example, our real strength lies in the power of our example at home. Yes, I'm sure you would agree. Yes, ma'am.
Would you talk some about the October surprise, what it was and what your position is on it? Maybe a little bit of explanation for the students on what it was?
I guess I will forever be identified particularly with Iran and the hostage experience. Let me talk first about the fact that there are new indications today in the Middle East that your 6 countrymen, the 6 hostages, 6 Americans and 6 others at least, held in Beirut, might conceivably be approaching a day of freedom. I say conceivably, but because no one should go out far on any branches on that score. But there are some noises coming out of Beirut, as you've read in the newspapers in the last few days, and some noises coming out of Iran that suggest again the possibility that something could happen affecting Terry Anderson and others. And let me say in that respect, many of you have hung up yellow ribbons in recent months, the past year, in support of the troops, not necessarily in support of policy, but surely in support of our troops, our forces in this Gulf affair. Many of those yellow ribbons are coming down. Keep the yellow ribbons up a little while. They also speak with a sense of compassion and concern that I hope all Americans feel toward 6 Americans who have not regained their freedom, 2 of them after more than 6 years, which is outrageous, intolerable, and the most outrageous, violent example of abuse of fundamental human rights that I can cite anywhere. There is also the matter of the October surprise, which goes back to the hostage experience in Tehran. The October surprise, as some of you may know, is the term that was developed at that time in 1980 in the middle of the presidential election campaign when we were still held in Tehran. Mr. Carter was seeking re-election. He lost the campaign, and there was concern at that time in the Republican campaign headquarters that Mr. Carter might pull off what was called an October surprise, and that would see the hostages released before the election, which would have given, obviously, the Carter administration a major boost on electoral terms and conceivably have assured him another 4 years in office. The Republican campaign was obviously concerned that that might happen. And the charges now abroad in the media and elsewhere are that that concern on the part of the Republican entourage at that time extended to the point where they engineered a deal, supposedly, with elements of the Iranian government that would have seen us held and not released before the election, and thus help prevent an October surprise in return for assured arms shipments from the Reagan administration after that administration came into power in January. In the last few days, Mr. Foley, Speaker of the House, has announced that investigations will begin in both the House and the Senate, closed door to begin with, possible hearings later into these charges to lay at rest or to expand further on the possibility that those activities really occurred. I've taken the position myself, although I had no obvious way to speak. I have no way to say that I could speak to the evidence at hand at the time. I wasn't here. I've taken the position that I have seen no evidence that is sufficiently credible to me yet to support these allegations. I find it difficult, and I've been accused of being naive for this reason, to believe that any Americans in any responsible position, even in the middle of a hot election campaign, could have done something like this to hold American citizens in prison longer. If I am proven wrong, I will be sick at heart, and I think so will you. And I hope and pray that the charges are found to be unfounded. I think there is a possibility that elements of the Republican campaign at that time may have had contacts with the Iranians, but I am very skeptical that that evolved to the point of an actual deal. That's my position, and we will see what happens in the course of these investigations. How many of you, how many of you traveled abroad? A good many of you have. Are all of you seniors, or are there some less than seniors here? Some less than seniors. May I say this in respect to what I've just asked you? If you haven't traveled abroad in your college years, you've missed a bet. And if you've got the opportunity, still take it. And when you leave college, as every parent has told you and every commencement speaker has told you, real life hits you in the face, and your opportunities to travel and be out there footloose and fancy-free are a hell of a lot less. And any college today across this country that does not offer its students a summer abroad or a semester abroad, I think is missing the bet in expanding the perspective of our young people across this country. That's why, for example, I also tout the Peace Corps so much, because that's another example for Americans as individuals and for American young people as a group to broaden and deepen their perspective about this increasingly small world out there. How many of you are considering the Foreign Service? I think I asked before, 2 or 3. How many of you are considering the idea of a Peace Corps tour? Anyone? There's 1, 2 or 3. As the press reports of the last few days have indicated, about 10% of the Foreign Service today are former Peace Corps volunteers. They couldn't beat us, so they're joining us. I was one of those who was skeptical of the Peace Corps when it was put in place in 1960, and I confess today that I was wrong, and I am today a stout and strong admirer of what the Peace Corps does and what the Peace Corps experience does to young Americans who have served in it. How many of you are considering government service in this town or wherever? Most of you, or a lot of you. Again, I would simply remind you it's not a bad thing. I suspect among you are some who have been reminded even after only a week here that you'd like to replace your representatives or your senators eventually. And I encourage you in that. Having had that opportunity once and not taking it, that's a choice that can be very attractive too. How many of you are sons or daughters of public officials? At least 1. But let's get back to foreign policy. Are there any other questions? Let me also, as I take the opportunity in talking to all American youth, young people audiences, get to know your immediate neighbors. 10 years down the pike, when you people will be in positions of leadership in some place or another, even in the public or the private sector, I think there are a few countries that are going to be more important to us than Canada and Mexico, our immediate neighbors. Particularly, of course, if Mr. Bush and others in both political parties have success in encouraging some kind of a North American free trade area. But also because of the obvious problems and potential of the American-Mexican relationship. It's all there, and it's increasingly in Southwest United States. Mexico is. And not least, Canada. I have a passion about Canada. I am the beneficiary. I was the beneficiary in 1980. You may remember of something called the Canadian Caper, when the government of Canada, the people of Canada, helped 6 of my staff from that embassy in Tehran escape. And they made that possible, the government of Canada did, by sacrificing their entire interests as a government, as a country in Iran. Political, strategic, economic, commercial. They set all of that aside and closed their embassy and spirited 6 American men and women out of that country. If you've ever had an example on the international scene of good neighborliness, that was it. And Americans, in my view, should never forget how fortunate we are in that small respect, yes, but also in broader dimensions to have Canada and a friendly country like that as our immediate neighbor. The former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Vesey, the United States Army, when he was chairman, once commented, this was in the middle of the Cold War, that the Soviet Union was the only country almost totally surrounded by hostile communist states. By contrast, he made the point, the United States has had the good fortune to be surrounded by friendly states, and not least Canada. And I also mentioned Canada in the context of its of noting that the real cartel, if you will, the real international cartel of the future may not be OPEC. It may be something called WAPEC. And that, particularly for you citizens of California, is a water cartel. And the major operative in that cartel will not be Saudi Arabia, but Canada. A lot of water up there. Yes, sir.
Elon College.
Which college?
From Elon College in North Carolina. Could you tell us about any of the interesting or surprising findings that the Commission on Public Service found in terms of public attitudes about young people going into public service especially?
Well, it found a number of obvious truths, I suppose. Government, the American people like that government that governs least. That's a healthy attitude on the part of the American people. Has been from the beginning of our times, that we are skeptical about government, particularly about big government. And let me make it clear, the Volcker Commission, the National Commission on Public Service, wasn't interested in promoting big government. Mr. Volcker, if anyone, is an exemplar of something else. Our concern was quality government on the job by its workforce, both career and non-career. We found, to our regret, what we had feared before, that these attitudes extended to our young people, particularly during the 80s, a decade of opulence, if you will. That's an overstatement. Young people, the best and the brightest of too few of the best and the brightest of our young people across the country were interested in public service and government. Again, I make the point, obviously not all of the best and the brightest of our young people should join government in this country. We need them in the private sector. But government needs its share of the best and the brightest, and if government is not getting it, then over the long term, we're in trouble. We found also that government was not sufficiently responsive to the needs that will be apparent, particularly in a decade or so, of drawing on minorities as they increase in size and potential in this country. So we made some recommendations in that area. We found that government was not paying its workers sufficiently, thus contributing to this lack of interest, not least on the part of young people who, coming out of college, have got a lot of debts to pay off and are pretty well often turned off and attracted instead to the private sector when the offers from government are as low or as unpromising as they are. We found that government was not sufficiently effective in training programs within government and enhancing the quality of what it had to do the job better. We found that we were reminded that government that touches Americans most is not the federal government, but state and local government, and that it is in that area as well that a good deal needs to be done to enhance its attractiveness, its efficiency on the job, and as a result of our recommendations in that area, we have several states that have put together their own commissions on public service, among other reasons, to attract young people such as you into state government and local government. There is also a national commission on state and local government that is studying the possibilities in that area. I think I've about used up my time, but if there's any other are there any other questions? I know my successor is in the audience already. Yes, sir.
Swing back towards foreign policy. You spoke up in your presentation about the enhanced role and reputation of the United Nations. This fall, the UN will elect a new Secretary General, which will that person will most likely lead the organization through the 90s into the next century. Do you have any comment or speculation on who the next Secretary General might be, or as a fellow diplomat or anything of that nature?
No, I don't. I don't know who is going to be. There is speculation in the press as to who it might be. There is speculation in particular that it is Africa's turn, for example, that an elder senior statesman, diplomat hopefully, I'd like to think that whoever takes over should have some feel for the practice of diplomacy. That might be the person to whom the community will turn. As you know, the choice is subject to veto of the 5 powers on the Security Council. A good deal of discussion going on at the moment, I gather, because it has to be done this fall, I believe, with the General Assembly this autumn endorsing or turning down whatever the recommendation might be. I agree with you. It's going to be it's a significant choice. It always is, because even when the role of the United Nations was less, or perceived as less, or seen as less, it was important. Today it is much more so, because of the way in which the United Nations today is involved in so many new and different ways, and its stature has been enhanced, and our attitudes toward it have been strengthened. Not regrettably yet, I don't think, to the point of paying all our debts to the United Nations. We are more in arrears than the Soviet Union as of now, but we're doing something about it if we can find it in our budget. Let me just close by saluting you again for the fact that you're here, that your commitment to service brought you to this town, that you are keeping an open mind about public service in government or elsewhere in the service of your country and in your communities. And let me say how much I envy you, not only because you're young, but also because you're young and likely and going to be participants in this country and its future over a very interesting decade, the last decade of the 20th century, a century that has not exactly set great examples in terms of some of the things that humankind have done to themselves and to each other during that time, not least the scale and potential of warfare. I guess I would say that I suspect few of you have stopped to think how lucky you are that you, 10 years from now, roughly, will be in positions of leadership from your community on up, possibly in the councils of government here in this city, at a time when this country enters the 3rd millennium of the Christian era. That's sort of awesome to think about, isn't it? And that's why I envy all of you. Good luck to all of you. Thank you.
You've been watching the remarks of former Chargé d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Iran, Bruce Langan. We now take a short break to look at the program schedule. Then we'll return to this Washington Center forum, and we'll bring you remarks by former CIA Director William Colby. Good evening from the nation's capital. You're watching C-SPAN. The cable satellite public affairs networks are nonprofit cooperatives created and supported by the national cable television industry. Before we check the schedule in the hours ahead, we'd like to remind you to join us tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Time for live coverage of a hearing conducted by a Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee. Members under the chairmanship of Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts will be looking at the foreign policy aspects of the ongoing BCCI investigation. Our schedule continues in a few moments as we stay with today's Washington Center Forum and the comments of William Colby, former Director of Central Intelligence. He spoke about the future of U.S. strategic intelligence. Just past 1 a.m. Eastern Time, the schedule continues with today's announcement by West Virginia Democratic Senator Jay Rockefeller that he's decided not to seek the Democratic presidential nomination next year. After that, you'll hear from representatives of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. That group today came out against the nomination of Judge Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court. And at about 3:30 a.m. Eastern Time, that's 12:30 Pacific, we bring you the remarks of the Secretary of Agriculture, Edward Madigan. He was the guest today of the Regional Reporters Association. That's a brief look at the schedule and the hours ahead for C-SPAN. Thank you for joining us.
Go behind the scenes of the events and issues you follow on C-SPAN with the C-SPAN Update. Designed specially for you, the update offers articles about our coverage, profiles of Washington insiders, and program highlights every week. So call 1-800-845-9000 for your subscription to the C-SPAN Update. And as a free gift, we'll send you Gavel to Gavel, a guide to watching the House and Senate.
Coming up next, we return to today's meeting of the Washington Center. This time, the topic turns to the future of U.S. strategic intelligence operations. You will hear from the former Director of Central Intelligence, William Colby. Now a defense and security consultant for several companies, Mr. Colby retired as head of Central Intelligence in 1975.
Welcome to the Washington Center. It's with great pleasure that I introduce to you our next speaker, William E. Colby. Mr. Colby holds a bachelor's degree from Columbia University. He was Director of Central Intelligence from 1973 to 1976. Earlier, he had been Chief of the CIA's Far Eastern Division from 63 to 68, and its Executive Director and Comptroller from 72 to 73. His intelligence career began during World War II when he parachuted into France and Norway to work with French and Norwegian resistance forces for the Office of Strategic Services. Since leaving the CIA, Mr. Colby's been a consultant on international and domestic political matters to various corporations, governments, and investment organizations. He's practiced international and American law in Washington, has written 2 books, Honorable Men and Lost Victory, and numerous articles, and has lectured and appeared in many different fora throughout the nation and abroad. He is counsel to Washington law firm of Donovan, Leisure, Rogovan, Hughes, and Scheller. Mr. Colby has received numerous awards and distinctions during his career, including the National Security Medal in 1976, and was a decorated World War II veteran. He's going to discuss today the issue with us of the future role of strategic intelligence. It's with great pleasure that I turn the podium over to him. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to have a chance to chat with you about the future of U.S. intelligence and where we're going with it. I think when you learned that I was coming, some of you sort of said, well, hot dog, we see a real live spy. And already some of you are a little disappointed. He doesn't look much like a spy. Where's the cloak? Where's the dagger? Where's the blonde? Isn't this what we get when we get a James Bond or something here? Well, I guess I've been a spy, even though I don't look like one. I've gone out of airplanes over enemy country, and I've flown around the jungles of Southeast Asia for paramilitary operations, and I've walked up the back streets of Central Europe to make secret meetings in little isolated apartments and that sort of thing. But I still don't look like that kind of an adventurous guy. And the reason is much more serious than the joke, because the reason I don't look like it is because intelligence has changed over these last years since I began my career in it. It's changed remarkably. We, Americans particularly, have conducted 4 major revolutions in intelligence in the last 40-odd years. The first of these we started right after Pearl Harbor, when we looked around to see why we were surprised by that sudden Japanese attack. And we realized that we should have been better warned, because we had information all over the American government that could have warned us better and had us on a better alert. But some of that information was in the Army, some was in the Navy, some was in the State Department, and it hadn't been brought to a central place so that it could be all looked at together and the right conclusions drawn from it. So when President Roosevelt decided he needed an intelligence service to fight the World War II that he was just in, he turned to an old friend of his named William Donovan from New York. He was a lawyer. He's the Donovan in the law firm I'm in today. But he turned to this fellow because he had a reputation of two things. First, he was heroic. He'd won a whole slew of medals on the battlefields of France in 1918. But also, he was thoughtful. He was very much of a student, an intellectual. And he was avidly curious about the world. He read all the books, he traveled around, looked at things, and all the rest.